Imagine waking up in a world that feels perfectly normal, where you go about your day with all the familiarity of routine, yet somewhere in a parallel dimension adjacent to your own, you experienced a fatal accident yesterday. In that other version of reality, you were struck by a vehicle while crossing an intersection you cross every single day, and you died instantly on impact, your consciousness simply ceasing to exist in that timeline while continuing uninterrupted in this one. The mechanism behind this haunting possibility rests in the quantum interpretation of many worlds theory, which suggests that at every moment of genuine uncertainty or branching point in causality, the universe splits into multiple versions where each possible outcome occurs in its own separate branch of reality. When you stepped into that street yesterday, there was a probability field that contained both outcomes, safe passage and fatal collision, and according to this framework, both events happened, just in different universes that are now permanently separated from each other. Your consciousness, bound to this particular thread of reality, continued forward unaware that in the adjacent branch, your other self simply ended, leaving behind a grieving family and a body that required identification and funeral arrangements. The peculiar darkness of this concept lies not in the physics themselves, but in the realization that this scenario has likely already occurred countless times across the infinite branching possibilities of parallel existence. Every dangerous moment you have ever survived represents a timeline where you did not survive, and that version of you no longer perceives anything at all. We live with this knowledge intellectually, but never emotionally, never truly feeling the weight of all those other deaths happening constantly in realities we cannot access or confirm, existing in a kind of quantum limbo where they are simultaneously real and entirely irrelevant to our conscious experience. In this parallel timeline, the outcome of World War II shifted at a critical junction in 1942, when German forces achieved decisive victories in North Africa and successfully breached the Soviet defensive lines before winter could fully settle across the Eastern Front, allowing the Nazi regime to consolidate control over continental Europe and establish a totalitarian order that would persist for generations into the future. The mechanism behind this darker reality stems from small but compounding military decisions. Better resource allocation, slightly different weather patterns that delayed Allied supply lines, and a few strategic commanders making marginally different tactical choices that collectively tipped the scales toward Axis dominance. Without the moral and military opposition that defined our actual history, this parallel world developed into a civilization where authoritarian governance became the assumed default, where individual freedoms were systematized into controlled components, and where entire populations learned to navigate life within rigid ideological frameworks that tolerated no dissent or alternative thought. The psychological architecture of such a world would normalize oppression through generations of cultural conditioning, where people born into this system would have no reference point for liberty, making freedom itself seem like a dangerous and chaotic concept rather than a fundamental human right. Decades pass in this timeline, and despite the inherent logical contradictions and inefficiencies of such rigid control systems, the regime persists because those living within it have never known anything different, because the propaganda apparatus rewires each new generation's understanding of normalcy before they can develop critical perspectives, and because the fear infrastructure runs so deep that questioning the system becomes unimaginable rather than merely dangerous. Imagine waking in a world where everyone you have ever known behaves as though you have never existed at all, where your childhood home belongs to strangers who have lived there for generations, where your parents have different children who bear no resemblance to you, where your siblings were never born and your extended family tree branches in entirely different directions without a single space marked for your name. The photographs on their walls show family gatherings you attended, yet your figure has been erased from every image, leaving strange gaps and awkward compositions that no one seems to notice or find unusual. Your school records contain no enrollment history, no yearbook photographs, no transcripts bearing your name, and your teachers have no memory of a student who sat in the third row by the window, asking questions during every mathematics lesson. The mechanism behind this reality operates on a principle of retroactive non-existence, where reality itself has been edited at the foundational level, rewriting causality backward through time to ensure that you were never born, that no biological chain of events led to your conception, that the specific moment which would have created you simply never occurred. Yet somehow, impossibly, you remain conscious and aware, trapped in a universe that has systematically removed all evidence of your presence while leaving your mind intact to witness the erasure. What makes this particularly unsettling is how your attempts to prove your existence only deepen the mystery. For any document you try to show them fades from physical reality before they can examine it. Any story you tell about shared experiences causes their eyes to glaze over with polite confusion. Any attempt to leave a mark or create new evidence results in that mark disappearing the moment you turn away. Imagine a universe where the solar system exists, where the sun burns with the same luminous intensity, where planets orbit in their silent dance through the void, yet Earth itself never coalesced from the primordial disk of dust and gas that surrounded our newborn star 4.5 billion years ago. In this parallel reality, the gravitational conditions that shaped our world failed to align at the critical moment, or perhaps a rogue planetary body passed through the inner solar system at precisely the wrong instant, disrupting the orbital mechanics that would have brought together the materials necessary for terrestrial formation. What remains in Earth's orbit is merely a sparse collection of asteroids and cosmic debris tumbling endlessly through the darkness, a graveyard of potential where our home world never drew its first breath of planetary existence. The other terrestrial planets persisted. Mercury still orbits close to the Sun, Venus still spins backwards through its sulfurous atmosphere, Mars continues its cold journey through the black. But the zone where life found its singular expression in this universe remained forever barren and desolate. Consider what this absence means on a conceptual level, a void so profound that no human consciousness ever emerged to contemplate it, no civilization arose to look upward at the stars, no language developed to name the countless wonders of existence. The universe itself did not become diminished by this absence in any objective sense, for the laws of physics operate with indifferent precision whether anyone observes them or not, yet something fundamental shifts in the existential weight of that reality. Life emerged elsewhere perhaps, on distant worlds orbiting distant suns, but humanity never was, and all the art and music and love and suffering that characterizes our species simply never took place in that timeline. Imagine waking up in a parallel universe where scientists have perfected the art of cloning, and they have created an exact biological duplicate of you at the precise moment of your birth in that world. This clone shares your DNA, your exact physical blueprint, your voice, your face, and theoretically every neurological pathway that makes up the architecture of your consciousness. Yet despite this perfect biological symmetry, your clone despises you with an intensity that borders on pathological. When you meet this other version of yourself, you do not recognize a mirror but rather an enemy, someone who views your existence as a personal affront, who resents that you occupy space in the world, who feels that your mere presence somehow diminishes their validity or authenticity. The mechanism behind this seemingly illogical hatred operates through the simple fact that while your clone shares your biology, they do not share your experiences, your memories, your specific sequence of lived moments that have shaped you from birth until this meeting. They grew up in a different household, encountered different people, made different choices at crucial junctures, and accumulated an entirely separate history of sensations and decisions. This divergence means that by the time you meet, you are not truly the same person anymore. Your clone sees you not as a twin, but as a usurper, someone who got to be the original while they are relegated to being the copy, and this asymmetry of identity creates a profound psychological wound. They may intellectually understand that their hatred is irrational, that both of you are equally real and equally valid, yet the emotional truth of their resentment persists regardless, simmering beneath any rational justification, a deep and abiding bitterness that no amount of logic or shared biology can dissolve or explain away to either of your satisfactions. Imagine waking in a body that is not yours, in a world whose geography shifts subtly with each passing day, where the people you love wear different faces but speak with voices you recognize perfectly, and you possess all their memories as if they were your own, yet something essential tells you that you have crossed a threshold into existence itself. In certain parallel universes, consciousness does not remain bound to a single physical form or timeline, but instead transfers fluidly between different versions of reality, carrying with it the accumulated experiences and memories of every iteration it has inhabited. A person might fall asleep in one world as a teacher with a family and a mortgage, only to awaken in another dimension as a musician with entirely different relationships and circumstances, yet retaining perfect clarity of both lives simultaneously, creating a fragmented yet oddly coherent sense of self that spans across infinite variations. The mechanism behind this phenomenon appears rooted in the idea that consciousness itself is not produced by the brain, but rather filtered through it, acting as a kind of receiver for a universal field of awareness that exists independently across all dimensions at once. When certain conditions align in these parallel worlds, perhaps through electromagnetic anomalies or quantum fluctuations that science cannot yet measure, a conscious entity's perceptual anchor can slip from one-dimensional frequency to another, dragging along the full weight of memory and identity. Over time, individuals who experience these transfers begin to realize they have lived countless lives across countless worlds, each one feeling equally real, equally true, and equally theirs, and yet they continue functioning in their current world as though nothing unusual has occurred, meeting their obligations, maintaining their relationships, and performing their daily routines while simultaneously aware that they might transfer again at any moment, might wake tomorrow as someone else entirely. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that you are not the person you believed yourself to be, but rather the darker reflection of your true self living in an alternate dimension. In this parallel universe, every moral choice you have made in your reality was reversed before you were even born. The version of you that exists there has committed acts you would never consider, harbors intentions you would find abhorrent, and has built a life on the foundation of deception and cruelty rather than kindness and integrity. In your world, you are known as honest and compassionate, yet somewhere across the dimensional barrier, your counterpart is notorious for manipulation and selfishness. The people who love you in your universe despise that other you with genuine hatred, and the relationships you have carefully nurtured would be weaponized and destroyed by their evil equivalent. This concept emerges from our deep psychological need to believe in the coherence of identity across different contexts and realities. We assume that our essential nature remains constant, that the decisions we make define us permanently, and that our moral character is fixed and unchangeable. However, the premise suggests that this assumption might be fundamentally flawed. If circumstances had been merely slightly different during your formation, if your parents had made different choices, if you had experienced different trauma or different kindness, you might have become that darker version instead. The unsettling persistence of this idea, despite its lack of logical foundation, rests in our inability to fully control or understand our own capacity for harm. We live daily with the knowledge that we contain multitudes, that we are capable of both tremendous good and terrible evil, yet we have constructed elaborate narratives to convince ourselves that we chose the good path and that path alone defines us. This parallel universe version represents the roads not taken, the impulses not followed, and the darker instincts we suppress. Yet the possibility remains perpetually unsettling. In a parallel universe nearly identical to our own, the inhabitants experienced a moment of collective realization that their world had fundamentally ceased to exist, though their bodies and minds continued moving forward through what remained of physical space. The universe in question had been operating under a set of physical laws that were sustainable only under very specific conditions, and on this particular day, those conditions quietly expired without fanfare or cosmic announcement. The stars continued to shine, the planets continued their orbits, and the people continued to breathe and speak and move about their daily routines, yet something essential had withdrawn from reality itself, leaving behind only the hollow machinery of existence. The psychological mechanism behind this phenomenon involves a profound threshold where the universe itself reached a critical point of entropy and philosophical contradiction, where the very substrate that allowed for meaning and causality began to decompose at the quantum level. The inhabitants could not point to any single catastrophic event because there was none. Instead, reality had simply expired like a contract reaching its natural conclusion, the way a story ends not with a bang, but with the final word written and the pen set down. What made this particularly haunting was not the ending itself, but the fact that nobody truly noticed it happening. The people of that universe continued to plan for futures that would never arrive, continued to invest in projects that reality would no longer support, continued to love and hope and dream in a world that had already stopped being real while maintaining perfect consistency with its own laws of physics. They had normalized the subtle wrongness, the barely perceptible lag between cause and effect, the strange flatness that had begun to characterize every experience, every interaction, every moment of consciousness. In a parallel universe, there exists a version of you who made different choices at critical junctures, and in that world they have become the person you might have been, living the life you could have lived if circumstances had aligned differently. This alternate version inhabits a body identical to yours, walks through versions of your childhood home, speaks with the same inflections and mannerisms, yet their memories diverge from yours at specific branching points where probability shifted. They wake in a bedroom that mirrors yours, though the walls might be a different color, the window facing a slightly different angle of light. They carry the same genetic predispositions and starting conditions that you do, but their decisions and the decisions of those around them have sculpted them into someone distinctly themselves. The mechanism behind this reality is rooted in the quantum principle that every choice creates a branching pathway, suggesting that at each decision point in your life, a universe spawns where you made the opposite choice. Your alternate self didn't take that job you refused, didn't move to that city you avoided, didn't end that relationship you preserved. They married someone you never met, pursued a career you abandoned in your teenage years, lived in a neighborhood you only passed through once. The peculiar darkness of this concept is not that they exist, but that you will never know them, never compare notes, never understand the subtle differences that accumulated over decades of divergent choices. Despite the logical impossibility of truly knowing another version of yourself, we are haunted by the mathematical inevitability that such versions exist somewhere in the infinite branching structure of reality. We have normalized this darkness by rarely discussing it, by accepting that parallel lives are theoretical constructs rather than genuine possibilities, yet every time you wonder what might have been, you are thinking about them. Imagine standing at a crossroads in your life, a moment where you made a decision that felt significant at the time, perhaps choosing one career path over another, or selecting a partner from among several people who loved you, or deciding to move to a city that called to you despite the risks involved. In a parallel universe adjacent to your own, you made the opposite choice, and that version of yourself has been living an entirely different life ever since that single moment of divergence. The unsettling part is not merely that this other you exists somewhere in the vast multiverse, but rather that in certain rare moments of profound exhaustion or meditation or grief, you can almost feel the echo of their decisions rippling backward through time, creating a strange sensation of phantom memories that never happened to you but somehow feel familiar. You remember the apartment you never rented, the job you never took, the person you never married, with such vivid detail that your brain struggles to categorize whether these are false memories, daydreams, or genuine impressions bleeding through from an adjacent timeline. Psychologically, this phenomenon relates to how our brains construct identity through narrative and choice. Each decision we make becomes a thread in the tapestry of who we believe ourselves to be, and the paths not taken become psychological ghosts that haunt the periphery of our consciousness. We normalize the existence of these phantom selves by calling them regrets or what-ifs, by treating them as products of our imagination rather than acknowledging the unsettling possibility that consciousness itself may not be as localized and singular as we have been taught. The deeper mystery persists in the fact that we cannot prove these impressions are false, and we cannot prove they are real, yet we continue living as though we are entirely separate from ourselves across all possible variations, when perhaps the truth is far more interconnected and less comfortable than we have ever allowed ourselves to fully consider. Imagine a universe where the biological process we call death has simply never occurred, where organisms do not deteriorate, where cellular decay and organ failure remain entirely foreign concepts that never evolved into existence, and where every living creature that has ever been born continues to exist in some form indefinitely, accumulating experiences and consciousness across stretches of time so vast that they become incomprehensible to minds structured like ours. In this parallel reality, the beings inhabiting it have never needed to develop the psychological frameworks we use to process mortality, have never created religions or philosophies centered on the afterlife, have never written elegies or songs mourning the departed, and have never felt the urgent pressure that death places upon our choices and priorities. The mechanism behind this absence of death in that universe might stem from a fundamental difference in their biochemistry, where entropy operates differently at the cellular level, or where their evolutionary path led them toward biological structures that simply do not degrade, regenerate infinitely without senescence, and maintain their structural integrity across epochs. This creates a civilization where concepts like legacy and urgency lose their weight entirely, where the motivation to create art or preserve knowledge becomes unmoored from the fear of being forgotten, and where the generational transmission of wisdom becomes almost unnecessary since the elder members never leave. Yet what persists most disturbingly in that universe is a kind of existential horror born from the opposite direction. A dread not of ending, but of endless continuation, of memories accumulating without closure, of witnessing civilizations rise and fall while remaining forever unchanged oneself, trapped in consciousness like an insect in amber across billions of years, watching everything transform while the self remains locked in perpetual stasis. Unable to escape into the mercy of oblivion that we take for granted. Imagine waking in a universe where the people you've shared your entire life with, your parents, your spouse, your children, your closest friends, are functionally identical in appearance and voice, yet fundamentally unrecognizable to you in every meaningful way. You look at your mother's face and see the architectural features you've known since birth, the same eyes, the same smile, yet when she speaks, her thoughts are foreign, her values are incomprehensible, her emotional responses to your suffering are muted or absent altogether. She exists beside you as a perfect stranger wearing the mask of intimacy. The mechanism behind this haunting reality is rooted in what neuroscientists call the recognition paradox. While our brains are exceptionally wired to identify faces and voices through pattern recognition, true recognition of another person depends entirely on shared context, mutual understanding, and emotional resonance. In this parallel universe, all of that has been systematically inverted, leaving you with the uncanny experience of knowing someone completely while understanding them not at all. You can recite their biographical details, where they were born, what they studied, the events of their lives, yet their consciousness remains sealed away behind their eyes, inaccessible and alien. The cruelest aspect of this reality is that it persists invisibly, because the social infrastructure of relationship remains perfectly intact. You still live together, you still share meals, you still exchange the words that families are supposed to exchange, and yet every conversation feels like you're communicating across an infinite distance, shouting through glass that neither of you can break. Over time, people in these universes learn to accept this as normal, creating elaborate social scripts and behavioral patterns that simulate closeness, while protecting themselves from the existential horror of true isolation within proximity, until they can no longer remember what genuine connection ever felt like. Imagine waking in a universe where causality operates in complete reverse, where every effect precedes its cause, where you experience the ending of moments before their beginning, and where the entire arrow of entropy flows in the opposite direction from what your consciousness recognizes as natural. In this place, you would find yourself living through your day in what we might call retrospective sequence, experiencing sensations and events that have already concluded before they commence in the conventional sense, moving through minutes and hours that feel as though they are being undone rather than lived. A cup of water would unspill itself back into your hand, wounds would unwound themselves, conversations would unhappen as they were being spoken, and every action you took would be something you had already completed in the distant moments of your own future. The psychological mechanism behind this inverted temporality would function through a complete reorganization of how consciousness itself processes sequence and duration. Your brain, evolved in a universe where time flows forward relentlessly, would struggle to construct coherent narratives from a reality where you remember the endings of conversations before hearing their beginnings, where you know the conclusions of events before witnessing their causes unfold. The human mind, fundamentally dependent on causal chains to create meaning and understanding, would find itself trapped in a perpetual state of déjà vu mixed with premonition, experiencing every moment as something both anticipated and already past. What makes this reality particularly unsettling is that such a universe would be perfectly self-consistent and mathematically sound according to the laws of physics, requiring only that we flip the direction of the temporal coordinate. Entropy could still increase, thermodynamics could still hold, and all physical laws would function identically, simply with opposite temporal orientation. Consider for a moment the mathematical inevitability that exists within the framework of infinite parallel universes, where every possible outcome of every possible decision branches into its own distinct reality, creating an incomprehensibly vast multiverse of coexisting worlds. If this model is true, then somewhere in the infinite expanse of existence, you have already died in nearly every conceivable way imaginable. In one universe, you perished in a car accident on a Tuesday morning that you avoided in this reality by choosing a different route to work. In another, you succumbed to an illness that never manifested in your timeline. In countless others, you made different choices at critical junctures that led to fatal consequences you cannot even fathom. There exists a version of you that never survived childhood, another that drowned at age 7, another that was never born at all because your parents made different decisions years before your conception. The sheer probability suggests that the vast majority of your parallel selves are not alive to contemplate this thought. This reality operates on a peculiar logic where your continued existence in this specific universe becomes almost statistically miraculous, a singular thread of consciousness persisting while infinite variations of you have already crossed into oblivion. The mechanism at work here is essentially the survival bias of quantum reality, where you can only be aware of the universe in which you survived, creating an illusion of singular identity when in truth you are merely the one iteration of countless selves that made it this far. What makes this concept truly unsettling is how easily we dismiss it, compartmentalizing the knowledge of our infinite deaths while walking through daily life as though we are the only version of ourselves that matters, when in fact we are simply the lone survivors of an infinite cemetery of our own possible selves, haunting our own alternative graves that we will never visit. Imagine standing at a crossroads in your life, faced with a decision that feels genuinely consequential, whether to accept a job offer in a distant city, to reach out to someone from your past, to pursue a creative passion instead of financial security, or to end a relationship that no longer serves you. In that moment of hesitation, you exist in a state of quantum possibility, and the moment you commit to one path, you irrevocably close off infinite others. The many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics suggests that every decision you make causes reality itself to branch, spawning parallel universes where you made the opposite choice. In one universe, you took the job and found happiness and fulfillment in your new life, building deep connections and discovering talents you never knew you possessed. In another universe, you declined and remained in your hometown, where you met someone extraordinary, deepened existing relationships, and found contentment in stability and familiarity. Both versions of you are equally real, equally valid, and equally convinced that your choice was the right one. The mechanism behind this phenomenon rests in the fundamental nature of existence itself, that consciousness and choice collapse the wave function of possibility into singular reality, yet the rejected possibilities do not simply vanish. They continue to exist in branching timelines where different versions of you are living out those alternate narratives with the same sense of inevitability and authenticity that you experience now. What makes this particularly unsettling is how casually we move through our lives without acknowledging the staggering weight of what we're doing. Every morning when you choose which route to take to work, every conversation where you decide whether to speak honestly or stay silent, every instance of choosing chocolate over vanilla, we are not merely selecting between options, but actively erasing infinite timelines where we chose differently. Consider the profound possibility that in another universe, a version of you exists right now experiencing tremendous suffering, and that this alternate iteration of your consciousness is fully aware of your existence as well, aware that somewhere across the dimensional barrier, another you is living a life of relative comfort or perhaps different suffering entirely, and this knowledge creates a secondary layer of anguish that transcends the original pain. This other you cannot reach you, cannot warn you, cannot ask for help, and exists in a state of perpetual isolation, made infinitely worse by the absolute certainty that relief exists just beyond a wall that cannot be breached. The psychological mechanism underlying this dark reality operates on the principle of comparative consciousness, where suffering gains its weight not only from pain itself, but from the knowledge that an alternative state exists, that your atoms and your essence could have arranged themselves differently in a different quantum thread, and that version of you is paying the price for whatever choices or chance events led to their particular suffering. We normalize this through our collective inability to acknowledge what we cannot prove, through our focus on our own timeline and our own immediate experiences. Yet the mathematics of infinite universes suggests this scenario is not merely possible but inevitable, occurring not once but countless times across dimensional variations. The cruelty lies not in the suffering itself, but in the meta-awareness of it, the consciousness experiencing pain while simultaneously being aware that consciousness is also experiencing different pain elsewhere, creating a fractal pattern of distress that multiplies with each added layer of awareness, each additional version of self trapped in their own suffering while knowing relief exists in forms they cannot access or communicate with. Consider for a moment the mathematical inevitability that somewhere across the infinite expanse of parallel universes, there exists not just one version of you, but countless versions, each one diverging at every single decision point you've ever encountered, and indeed at every decision point you never made at all. In one universe, you chose the blue shirt this morning instead of the gray one, and that single choice cascaded into an entirely different day, different conversations, different outcomes that ripple forward through time. In another parallel reality, you woke up 5 minutes earlier, and that small temporal shift altered the traffic patterns you encountered, the people you crossed paths with, the very trajectory of your existence in ways both subtle and profound. The truly unsettling aspect of this concept is not merely that these infinite versions exist, but that they all carry your consciousness, your memories up to that singular branching point, your subjective sense of being you, and then they diverge completely. Each version of you in these parallel universes experiences their own reality as singular and real, just as you experience yours, completely unaware of the infinite other yous living out their own narratives simultaneously. The mechanism behind this persistence is rooted in the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, which suggests that every quantum event that could have multiple outcomes actually produces all outcomes, each spawning its own branch of reality. Every time you make a choice, every time you face uncertainty, the universe itself splits, creating new versions of you to experience each possible outcome. What makes this concept particularly disorienting is how we have inadvertently normalized the idea without truly accepting its implications, treating it as an abstract scientific curiosity rather than confronting what it means for your identity, your uniqueness, and your sense of self. In this parallel universe, the singular catastrophe you have spent your entire life dreading, the one fear so deeply embedded in your psyche that you have unconsciously organized your existence around avoiding it, has come to pass, and you are now living within the aftermath of that realized nightmare. Perhaps it was the loss of someone irreplaceable, or the public humiliation you always knew would destroy your sense of self, or the diagnosis that confirmed every fragile assumption about your mortality, or the betrayal by the person you trusted most in this world, and now you exist in a reality where that theoretical horror has become your concrete, undeniable present. The psychological mechanism at work here is both straightforward and devastating. We spend our lives constructing elaborate mental fortifications against our deepest fears, believing that if we simply worry enough, prepare enough, or remain vigilant enough, we can somehow exempt ourselves from suffering. Yet the universe operates indifferently to our emotional hedging, and what we most feared often arrives not because we failed to prevent it, but because fear itself is sometimes merely a premonition of probability. In this parallel world, you are discovering something profoundly unsettling. You are still alive, still conscious, still capable of thought and breath and movement, despite the catastrophe you once believed would annihilate you completely. The fear you carried all those years promised annihilation, promised that survival would be impossible, promised that this particular outcome would be the end of everything that matters. Yet you are experiencing the peculiar and almost disturbing discovery that humans are far more resilient than their fears suggest, that we continue existing even after the worst happens, that life does not simply stop when our nightmare becomes reality. In this parallel universe, you possess a complete and vivid memory of a person who never actually existed in your life, someone whose absence should be obvious, but somehow feels like a presence you've always taken for granted. And the strangest part is that no one around you seems to notice or question this anomaly because they share the same false recollection with perfect consistency. You remember their voice with crystalline clarity, the specific way they laughed at certain jokes, the texture of conversations you had with them during formative moments of your existence. Yet if you search through photographs or ask others to describe this person, the details become impossibly vague or contradict your own memories entirely. This phenomenon operates on a profound psychological level, where the human brain constructs false nostalgia so convincingly that the emotional weight of these invented relationships often surpasses that of actual friendships and connections in your waking life, creating a dissonance that your conscious mind refuses to acknowledge or process. The mechanism underlying this reality is rooted in how memory and identity intertwine. Our sense of self is built partially through our relationships and the role others play in our narratives, and in this universe, your mind has generated an entire person to fill a void you didn't know existed, complete with dialogue and shared experiences that feel more real than many authentic memories. What makes this particularly unsettling is that this fabrication persists despite logical evidence pointing to its impossibility. Yet we accept it as natural, the way we accept so many inconsistencies in our own reality without scrutiny. Moving through our days with people we genuinely believe we know, while occasionally catching ourselves unable to recall their actual faces or verify they were ever really there at all. In a parallel universe, humanity awoke one morning to discover that all written and spoken language had simply ceased to exist, not through any catastrophic event or technological failure, but through a gradual process of collective forgetting that no one could quite remember beginning. The people in that world could still think in abstract patterns, could still experience emotion and memory, but the bridge between internal thought and external communication had vanished entirely, leaving them in a state of profound isolation despite living in crowded cities and families. They moved through their days with an almost ritualistic quality, using gestures and sounds that held no consistent meaning, pointing at objects and making utterances that varied from person to person, from moment to moment. Yet somehow society continued to function through an intricate system of intuition and learned behavioral patterns that had replaced what language once provided. The mechanism behind this strange persistence lies in humanity's remarkable capacity to adapt and find alternative pathways for survival. Without words to explain their circumstances, people simply accepted the world as it was, creating elaborate systems of sign and symbol that operated beneath the threshold of true language, much like how animals communicate through scent and body posture. They built, they created, they even produced art, all through mimicry and repetition, and an almost supernatural understanding of unspoken intention that developed between long-term companions and communities. What makes this reality so deeply unsettling is not the absence of language itself, but rather how quickly the inhabitants normalized this void, how they constructed entire frameworks of meaning from silence and gesture, never questioning why they could no longer access the tool that had defined human consciousness for millennia. Imagine stepping into a universe where the fundamental laws of physics operate not as immutable constants, but as suggestions that reality occasionally ignores, where gravity functions inconsistently depending on what time of day it is, or where the speed of light varies based on observer expectation, where mass and energy refuse to maintain their conversion rates, and where entropy sometimes reverses itself without explanation or warning. In this universe, objects do not always fall downward, instead drifting sideways or upward in defiance of what should be inevitable. Yet the inhabitants have adapted so thoroughly to these violations that they no longer perceive them as violations at all. The sky might refuse to obey atmospheric pressure laws, creating pockets where sound travels backward through time, or where light bends in ways that would require negative mass to exist, yet negative mass simply does casually without the universe collapsing into contradiction. What sustains this reality is not that the laws are rewritten, but that the observers have internalized a framework where physics itself is negotiable, contextual, dependent on collective belief and momentary consensus. The psychological mechanism that allows this is profound normalization, the human capacity to accept the utterly abnormal as baseline reality when it is all one has ever known, to stop asking why when the alternative is the terrifying recognition that existence itself operates on no coherent principle whatsoever. The inhabitants of this universe do not experience anxiety about these breakdowns because they possess no reference point for how physics should work, no measuring stick from our world to reveal the cracks in theirs. They have constructed explanations that circle back on themselves, creating logical justification for the unjustifiable, building philosophies that celebrate inconsistency as a feature rather than a bug. In this parallel universe, you exist as the antagonist of an elaborate narrative you never chose to enter, where every decision you have made, every belief you hold dear, and every action you take is perceived through the lens of moral corruption by those around you. The people who love you in your world regard you there with suspicion and disdain, interpreting your kindness as manipulation and your ambitions as selfish conquest. Your genuine attempt to help a friend becomes viewed as an attempt to control them, your pursuit of career success is seen as ruthless climbing over others, and your desire for personal happiness is categorized as narcissistic indulgence. The mechanism behind this phenomenon operates on a fundamental psychological principle: perspective determines morality in the absence of omniscient truth. In that universe, the narrative structure places you at the center of suffering, making you responsible for circumstances entirely beyond your control. And because humans naturally construct stories with heroes and villains, those around you have collectively decided that you must be the latter. Your version of events, your motivations, your internal experience of your own goodness, holds no weight against the unified interpretation of your actions by the community that surrounds you. What makes this particularly haunting is that you might be living this exact reality right now without ever knowing it, that somewhere in someone's story, you are already the villain, already the source of their suffering, already the cautionary tale they tell themselves. We have normalized this fragmented existence where multiple truths coexist simultaneously, where you are simultaneously protagonist and antagonist depending on whose eyes are observing, and where your moral character is entirely dependent on narrative framing rather than any objective standard. You may wake knowing you tried your best, yet sleep understanding that somewhere, someone is falling asleep hating you for it. Imagine waking up in a parallel universe where the concept of memory as we know it simply does not function. In this reality, you exist in a continuous present moment, unable to retain any information about previous experiences, conversations, or events, no matter how significant they were mere moments before. You might have a conversation with someone you love deeply, and when that conversation ends, it dissolves completely from your consciousness as though it never occurred. You walk through your home and recognize the furniture, the layout, the objects around you, yet you cannot recall how you acquired them or why they matter. The strange part is that you function. Your body moves with purpose. You navigate spaces with an eerie precision. You engage in tasks that seem practiced and refined, yet you have no memory of practicing them. It appears that your muscle memory, your procedural knowledge, your physical habits all remain intact, creating a deeply unsettling disconnect between what your body knows and what your mind can access. The psychological mechanism behind this phenomenon relates to the separation of implicit and explicit memory systems. In our universe, these systems work together seamlessly, creating a unified sense of continuous identity and experience. But in this parallel world, explicit memory, the conscious recall of facts, events, and personal history, has been severed entirely, leaving only the ghostly traces of implicit memory that guide your actions without your awareness. People in this universe have adapted to this condition so completely that they do not experience it as a disability or tragedy, but rather as the simple nature of existence. They have built societies and systems that function within this constraint. Written language serves as external memory. Objects are labeled. Routines are rigidly structured. Relationships exist in isolated moments of intense connection followed by complete forgetting, and somehow, impossibly, this dark reality persists as a functional world, suggesting that memory itself might be far less essential to consciousness than we have always believed. Imagine the moment you remember as your greatest achievement, your purest joy, the peak of human contentment in your life, the day you graduated, the moment you fell in love, the instant you held your child for the first time, or the afternoon you finally reached a goal you had pursued for years. In this parallel universe, that moment exists, but it no longer belongs to you. Instead, it has been subtly grafted onto someone else's memory, someone else's identity, someone else's life narrative. You retain the knowledge that something important happened on that date, but the emotional resonance has been completely severed. You remember the facts with clinical precision, the location, the weather, the clothes you wore, the words that were spoken. Yet when you attempt to access the feeling itself, you find only a hollow echo, like remembering a movie you watched rather than an experience you lived. The happiness that once radiated from that memory has been extracted entirely, leaving behind only the skeleton of the event. What makes this phenomenon particularly insidious is the mechanism by which it functions. The universe operates on a principle of emotional conservation, where the intensity of feeling you possessed in that moment must exist somewhere, and in this reality, it has simply been transferred to another consciousness. That other person now experiences your joy, your triumph, your sense of completion, and they do not question it because from their perspective, they earned it. Meanwhile, you are left with memories that feel borrowed, achievements that feel hollow, and a life narrative that appears successful on the surface but feels fundamentally hollow in your innermost self. Most disturbing is how people have learned to live with this condition, how they have normalized the disconnection between the memory and its emotional weight, treating life as a series of documented events rather than a series of felt experiences, moving forward with the assumption that happiness is merely a statistical measure rather than something that should be genuinely, authentically experienced. Imagine a universe where the fundamental conditions necessary for stellar formation simply never aligned, where the cosmic processes that led to the ignition of hydrogen fusion across billions of galaxies never quite reached their critical threshold in that particular reality. In this dark corner of the multiverse, the universe expanded in such a way that the density fluctuations in the primordial plasma were just slightly too uniform. Or perhaps the fundamental constants that govern gravity and nuclear forces were shifted by margins so infinitesimal that they prevented the collapse of gas clouds into the protostellar configurations necessary for star birth. The early universe would have remained largely dark, with only the faint afterglow of the Big Bang itself providing any illumination at all. A cosmos of pure blackness punctuated by diffuse hydrogen clouds that drifted through the void without ever achieving the gravitational compression needed to ignite them. Without stars, there could be no planets, no solar systems, no stable orbits where complex chemistry might unfold over billions of years, and certainly no mechanism through which the heavier elements like carbon and oxygen could be forged in stellar furnaces and scattered across space when those stars eventually died. What makes this scenario psychologically unsettling is that it represents not a catastrophic event or a dramatic collision, but rather the simple absence of the very process that made our existence possible, a universe that looks complete and whole and infinite, yet remains fundamentally sterile and lifeless in ways we can barely articulate. We normalize the existence of stars so completely that we rarely consider how contingent their formation truly was, how they emerged from nothing more than temperature fluctuations in the first moments after creation and the patient work of gravity across millions of years. In this parallel universe, every significant choice you made in your life, you chose the opposite. Where you selected a career in medicine, here you became an artist. Where you married your high school sweetheart, here you ended that relationship at 19 and pursued a different person entirely. Where you moved to the city, here you stayed in your hometown. Where you invested in that business opportunity, here you let it pass. The accumulation of these inverted decisions has created a life that is not worse or better, but fundamentally alien to you, yet somehow familiar in its structure. You recognize the skeleton of your existence, but every bone has been rearranged, every vital organ placed where it does not belong. The psychological mechanism at work here is both simple and devastating. Our identities are constructed not from who we are, but from the cascade of choices we made at critical junctures, and the weight we assign to those decisions creates a gravitational pull that anchors us to a specific version of reality. When you encounter this alternate self, the dissonance is profound because you can see the logic of their path as clearly as your own. They made sense of the same information differently, prioritized different values, and followed a thread just as coherent as the one you pulled. Yet in this universe, everyone you meet perceives you as the person who made those other choices, and they have formed their relationships, expectations, and entire social architecture around that identity. Your children here have different names and different faces. Your spouse is someone else entirely. Your closest friends are strangers. What makes this reality persist despite its fundamental wrongness is that we have normalized the illusion that our choices were inevitable, that the path we took was somehow the only logical one, when in truth, every decision was contingent and reversible. We seldom sit with the uncomfortable reality that we could have chosen completely differently and built an equally valid, equally real life. Imagine a parallel Earth, almost identical to ours in every measurable way, where civilization progressed at nearly the same pace, where cities rose and fell in similar patterns, where technology advanced along comparable trajectories, yet where this world exists in almost complete and utter silence. There are no birds singing in the trees, no insects chirping in the grass, no wind rustling through leaves in ways that produce the ambient background noise we consider natural and essential to life. The human cities hum with the mechanical sounds of machinery and traffic, but step outside those urban centers and you enter a void of sound so profound that it becomes unsettling, almost suffocating in its completeness. People on this earth have never known what a cricket sounds like, have never heard the distinct call of a songbird at dawn, have never experienced that sense of being surrounded by living acoustic presence that permeates our own world. The mechanism behind this silence is rooted in a subtle biological divergence that occurred millions of years ago, a branching point where sound-producing mechanisms in animals either never evolved or were selected against so thoroughly that they disappeared entirely. Where our insects developed chirping and buzzing as methods of communication and mating rituals, the animals on this parallel Earth relied entirely on visual signals, chemical signals, and tactile communication instead. Where our birds developed the complex vocal anatomy needed for song, Their evolutionary counterparts simply never required it. What makes this particularly haunting is how those living there have normalized this absence so completely that they do not experience it as absence at all. They have no framework of comparison, no ancestral memory or cultural reference point suggesting that the world should sound different. Their scientists study acoustics and sound theory in textbooks, understanding the physics perfectly well, yet they walk through forests that are utterly mute and feel nothing is wrong. Children are born into this silence and accept it as the fundamental nature of existence itself. In this parallel universe, the fundamental wiring of human sensation has been inverted at the neurological level, creating a civilization where physical pain produces the same neurochemical and emotional response that pleasure does in our world. When inhabitants of this reality experience injury, illness, or physical trauma, their brains release endorphins and dopamine in celebration rather than in compensation, flooding their consciousness with euphoria and satisfaction. A person might cut their hand and experience waves of joy cascading through their nervous system, or contract a fever and find themselves in a state of blissful contentment, their body celebrating what we would perceive as suffering. The most intense injuries produce the most powerful highs, creating a perverse hierarchy where severe burns, broken bones, and terminal illnesses become the most coveted experiences one could possibly undergo. Their entire civilization has evolved around this inverted pleasure principle, with pain clinics functioning as luxury resorts where wealthy citizens pay enormous sums to undergo carefully calibrated tortures designed to maximize their neurological reward. The psychological mechanism underlying this reality operates through a simple but complete reversal of evolutionary survival instinct. While in our universe pain serves as a warning system that motivates us to avoid harm and protect our bodies, in this parallel world pain has become the primary driver of joy and fulfillment, the very substance that makes existence feel meaningful and worth living. What we call self-care and health maintenance they experience as deprivation and suffering, and their entire medical establishment focuses on deliberately inflicting precise amounts of damage to optimize human happiness. In a parallel universe remarkably similar to our own, there exists a fundamental inversion of observation and awareness that has become so deeply woven into the fabric of existence that no one questions it anymore. The people of this world have lived for generations under the consistent, undeniable presence of entities that watch them continuously, and yet the most disturbing aspect is not the watching itself, but rather the complete normalization of being perpetually observed without consent or understanding of purpose. These watchers exist in the spaces between perception, visible only in peripheral vision and in the static of old technology, manifesting as shadows that move independently of light sources and as presences felt during moments of genuine solitude. What makes this reality particularly unsettling is that the inhabitants of this universe have constructed elaborate psychological frameworks to rationalize the sensation of being watched, attributing it to paranoia, overactive imagination, or the natural human tendency toward self-consciousness, when in fact the sensation is entirely grounded in a verifiable reality that their minds instinctively refuse to fully acknowledge. The mechanism behind this denial operates through a kind of cognitive dissonance so profound that even when people catch glimpses of the watchers, their brains immediately recontextualize the experience into something more palatable, something that fits within the boundaries of accepted reality. The watchers themselves remain silent and motionless, never intervening, never communicating, simply observing with an intensity that suggests purpose while simultaneously suggesting complete indifference to the observed. Imagine a parallel universe where you made every right decision at every crucial moment, where the career you pursued flourished beyond measure, where the relationships you invested in deepened into perfect understanding, where the risks you calculated actually paid off in ways that exceeded your projections, and where the version of yourself that exists in that alternate reality has accumulated victories so total and so complete that there seems to be no dimension of their existence left untouched by success. In this universe, that version of you wakes up to accolades, moves through days filled with recognition, builds wealth that compounds, maintains friendships that never fractured, never experienced the small humiliations that define ordinary human experience, and somehow managed to avoid the entropy that touches everything in our reality. The mechanism that makes this thought so psychologically potent is rooted in our fundamental inability to ever truly know the outcomes of paths not taken, combined with our deeply ingrained tendency to attribute our failures to circumstance while attributing others' successes to character. A cognitive asymmetry that allows us to imagine that parallel version as having been inherently wiser or more deserving. We construct this idea partly as motivation, partly as comfort, and partly as a way to externalize our disappointments, projecting them onto the architecture of probability rather than accepting them as integrated elements of who we have become. What persists about this concept despite its logical problems is that we continue to believe in it even as we age and accumulate evidence that perfection in alternate timelines is as mythological as anywhere else. That success in another universe would have brought its own particular weights and griefs, and that the version of you that won everything is almost certainly also the version that lost something irreplaceable in the process. In this parallel universe, human beings exist in a state of profound emotional absence regarding what we understand as romantic love, and the civilization has evolved entirely around this void as though it were never meant to exist at all. People form partnerships based on utility, genetic compatibility assessments, and social hierarchy alignment, with the process managed by neural compatibility algorithms that measure synchronization in sleep patterns, metabolic efficiency, and resource management capacity. When two individuals are paired by these systems, they cohabitate, reproduce according to population quotas, and maintain their households with the same detached competence one might observe in a well-organized business operation. Yet they experience no flutter of the heart, no yearning across distances, no desperate need to hear another person's voice at 3 in the morning. The neurochemistry exists in their brains, the dopamine receptors, the oxytocin pathways, the mirror neurons. But these biological systems activate only in response to professional achievement, intellectual conquest, or the acquisition of status, never in response to another human being as a romantic entity. Children in this world are taught early that the romantic narratives found in older human records are fabrications, psychological errors from primitive evolutionary stages, and they internalize this so completely that the very concept becomes incomprehensible to them, as foreign as the sensation of a color that does not exist. The machinery of their relationships persists because the infrastructure supports it. The legal frameworks, the economic incentives, the social expectations all function without requiring love as a component, and so generations pass in this state of connected solitude, where two people can share a bed for 50 years and feel the same emotional resonance as one might feel toward a comfortable chair. In a parallel universe running only slightly askew from our own, you find yourself in a workplace where you spent 17 years of your life attending mandatory daily meetings that lasted precisely 4 hours each. Meetings that contained no decisions, no actionable items, and no clear purpose beyond the simple fact that they had always been scheduled at that time on that day. You remember sitting in those fluorescent-lit conference rooms, watching the clock move with impossible slowness, feeling the peculiar numbness that comes from sustained purposelessness. And yet you attended every single one without ever questioning whether this was actually necessary or whether you possessed the authority to simply stop attending. The psychological mechanism at work here is a phenomenon sometimes called institutional inertia, combined with the internalized hierarchical voice that whispers to you that someone, somewhere, decided this was important, and that to question it would be to risk appearing incompetent or uncommitted, even though no one could articulate why the meeting existed in the first place. What makes this particular dark reality so disturbing is the recognition that you escaped this only by accident, only when the business closed due to circumstances entirely beyond your control, not because you ever gathered the will to break the pattern yourself. You wonder now how many of your days, how many of your finite hours on this planet, were consumed by a ritual that served no one and that disappeared instantly the moment external forces eliminated it, suggesting that it had never actually mattered at all. Yet the institutional apparatus had been perfectly designed to make you feel as though leaving would constitute some form of betrayal or failure on your part. This dark reality persists across many parallel universes because we have normalized the delegation of our time and attention to structures that we neither designed nor understand, and we have made questioning these structures feel like a personal character flaw rather than a reasonable exercise of judgment. Imagine standing in a cosmic observatory, gazing at a parallel universe that exists in a quantum state adjacent to our own, and being confronted with an unsettling realization. That universe is older than ours, perhaps by billions of years, despite having theoretically branched off from our timeline at some point in the past, which creates an impossible paradox that challenges our fundamental understanding of causality and temporal progression. The dark reality of this concept rests on the mathematical possibility that parallel universes may not all experience time at the same rate, or may have fundamentally different initial conditions from our own, meaning that what we perceive as the moment of their divergence from our timeline might actually be a point where their far more ancient history intersects with ours at a single point in spacetime. When we consider this deeply, we realize that an older parallel universe could have been developing civilizations, experiencing eons of evolution, building and collapsing empires, all while our universe was still in its infancy. And somehow these two realities exist simultaneously despite their vastly different ages and development stages. The psychological mechanism that makes this concept particularly disturbing is how it undermines our intuitive sense that time flows in one direction and that causality moves forward, forcing us to confront the possibility that age, wisdom, and progress in another dimension could be so distant from our own that comparison becomes meaningless, and that somewhere right now, in a universe occupying the same quantum probability space as ours, billions of years of history have already unfolded in what we experience as the present moment. In this parallel universe, you discover that your name, the identifier you have carried your entire life, the sound that has defined your personal existence since birth, holds absolutely no meaning or significance to anyone around you. When you introduce yourself, people hear the syllables but experience no recognition, no connection, no resonance with any aspect of your identity. Your name has become purely phonetic noise, a series of sounds that exist only in the moment they are spoken before dissolving entirely from memory and consideration. The letters on your documents, the signature on your contracts, the way your family calls you in the morning, all of these remain exactly as they always were, yet they now carry the weight of absolute insignificance, as though you had never been named at all. People forget your name within seconds of hearing it. They assign you numbers or descriptions instead. You become known only by your function or position, never by the personal identifier that was supposed to distinguish you from every other human being. The psychological mechanism at work here stems from the recognition that identity itself is constructed through collective agreement and social reinforcement. Your name only means something because everyone agreed it does, because society collectively assigned it value and continuity. In this universe, that agreement has been revoked without explanation. The structure of meaning collapses when the social contract surrounding personal identity dissolves. You remain aware that your name once mattered, but you cannot convince anyone else to care about it again. This persists as a normalized aspect of existence in this world because no one questions why names should hold meaning in the first place. The universe simply operates on the understanding that names are arbitrary tags, neither significant nor worth remembering, and this absence of meaning has been accepted as the natural order. In this particular parallel universe, the fundamental constant of gravitational attraction reversed its polarity approximately 3 million years ago, though the inhabitants have no memory of when this occurred because their entire recorded history exists within this inverted state. What exists in this reality is not a world where objects fall upward in a chaotic manner, but rather a civilization that has evolved every single biological and architectural principle around the assumption that gravity pulls toward the sky rather than toward the ground. The oceans exist as vast suspended bodies of water held in place by what they understand as the natural order, with the deepest trenches positioned high above in the atmosphere where the pressure becomes most intense, while the surface of their world exists in a perpetual state of gentle ascension. Mountains grow downward into what would be valleys in our understanding, and their forests extend their root systems into the air above while their canopies stretch toward the depths below. The inhabitants themselves evolved with skeletal structures oriented toward an upward-facing existence, their organs positioned, and their center of gravity calibrated for an entirely different directional pull than what we would recognize. What makes this reality particularly unsettling is not the inverted physics itself, but rather the psychological normalization of it across their entire civilization. They have built their societies with the same logic we employ, constructing buildings that anchor into what they perceive as the ground, establishing farms and settlements in patterns that seem logical within their context, but which represent a completely inverted reflection of our own spatial reasoning. They have no concept that their gravity might be reversed because there is no reference point for them to understand what reversal means. Consider the possibility that this moment right now, as you lie in bed listening to these words, is not actually a moment of wakefulness at all, but rather a deeply convincing layer within a dream from which you have never truly emerged. You went to sleep years ago, perhaps decades ago, and everything you believe to be your waking life since that moment has been constructed by your dreaming mind with such meticulous detail and consistency that you have never questioned its authenticity. The mechanism by which this occurs is remarkably simple from a neurological perspective. Your brain does not require external sensory input to create a complete and coherent reality. During sleep, your mind generates entire worlds, complete with cause and effect, memory, emotion, and logical progression, and while dreaming you experience absolute certainty that these fabricated realities are genuine. The longer you remain in this dream, the more elaborate it becomes, the more memories it accumulates, and the more difficult it becomes to distinguish from actual wakefulness. What makes this particularly unsettling is that there exists no objective test, no empirical method by which you could definitively prove to yourself that you are currently awake rather than dreaming, because your consciousness itself is the measuring instrument, and it would be the very tool being called into question. We have normalized this fundamental uncertainty by simply refusing to acknowledge it, by constructing social agreements and shared narratives that treat consensus reality as unquestionably real, as though enough people believing in the same world simultaneously somehow validates its existence independent of consciousness. Yet every person you know, every conversation you have had, every memory you carry could be nothing more than your sleeping brain generating increasingly sophisticated neural patterns, creating the illusion of continuity and meaning in a life that never actually began. In this particular parallel universe, the concept of color as we understand it has never developed, and inhabitants experience reality through a framework of pure luminosity and shadow instead. The world exists in infinite gradations of light and darkness, from the brightest white to the deepest black, but the wavelengths we perceive as red, blue, yellow, or green have no corresponding cognitive category in their minds or their language. What we would call a crimson sunset is perceived by them as simply a region of greater brightness transitioning toward deeper shadow, and they have developed an entirely different vocabulary to describe these distinctions, one based on intensity gradients rather than chromatic properties. Their eyes function differently at the neurological level, lacking the specialized cone cells that parse electromagnetic waves into distinct color experiences, and instead their visual cortex evolved to prioritize contrast, depth, and luminance information with extraordinary precision. When they look at objects we would describe as brilliantly colored, they see only subtle variations in how light and dark those objects are relative to their surroundings, and this has shaped their entire civilization, art, and understanding of nature in profound ways. Yet the most unsettling aspect of this reality is how completely normal and functional this system remains despite its radical difference from our own perception, and how their inability to perceive color has not limited their scientific progress or artistic expression, but merely redirected it into channels we might find alien. Their painters create stunning compositions using only monochromatic techniques of extraordinary sophistication. Their architects design buildings of breathtaking elegance using shape and shadow rather than chromatic contrast, and their scientists have developed color-independent technologies and methods of understanding the physical world that work just as effectively as our own approaches. In this parallel universe, you discover through fragmented memories and inexplicable knowledge that you have lived thousands of distinct lifetimes, each one complete with its own childhood, relationships, careers, deaths, and the full spectrum of human experience compressed into what should have been a single existence. The revelation comes not as a sudden shock but as a creeping awareness, where you find yourself remembering events that never happened to you in this current life, speaking languages you never learned, possessing skills you never trained for, and carrying emotional scars from losses you did not experience. Every person you meet in this world seems to trigger vague recollections of past encounters across what you somehow know were different centuries, different continents, different versions of civilization entirely, and yet nobody around you acknowledges this impossible history or treats it as unusual. The mechanism behind this phenomenon operates through a fundamental breakdown in the universe's temporal architecture, where the boundaries between sequential lifetimes have collapsed into a single consciousness that retains full access to all previous iterations simultaneously. Your brain somehow houses thousands of complete autobiographies, thousands of sets of relationships and professional identities, thousands of conflicting belief systems and value structures, all attempting to coexist within the limited architecture of a human mind. The logical impossibility should crush you immediately, and yet your consciousness somehow accommodates this weight, processing parallel threads of memory and experience as though they were simply different chapters in an incomprehensibly long book. What makes this persist is the normalization that develops around accumulated trauma and fragmentation. Imagine waking in a parallel universe where the sky itself challenges every assumption you hold about planetary mechanics and the nature of day and night. In this world, two suns orbit in a binary system, neither one dominant, neither one distant enough to be ignored, and both casting their light and heat upon a world that has adapted to their relentless presence over millions of years. The inhabitants of this realm have never known true darkness in the way you understand it, for even when one sun dips below the horizon, the other continues its arc across the sky, ensuring that twilight is the closest this world ever comes to night. The landscape reflects this dual illumination constantly, with shadows falling in two different directions simultaneously, creating a visual reality that would feel deeply wrong to human eyes accustomed to single-source lighting. Architecture in this world is designed around the assumption of perpetual illumination, with buildings featuring deep alcoves and underground chambers not for storage, but for the few precious hours when both suns align and create genuine shadow. The psychological weight of living under such conditions operates at a level you might not immediately recognize, for it is the absence of darkness that shapes consciousness rather than its presence. The human mind, throughout its evolution, has developed circadian rhythms tied to the cycle of light and dark, to rest and activity, to the predictable swing of night that allows for psychological restoration and the processing of emotion that occurs only in the absence of external stimuli. Here in this binary star world, that fundamental rhythm is broken or fundamentally altered, creating inhabitants who experience a kind of perpetual alertness, a condition that seems paradoxical and yet makes absolute biological sense. What persists in this reality despite defying everything we know about optimal conditions for consciousness is the simple human capacity to adapt, to normalize, to build culture and meaning around whatever conditions surround us, no matter how alien those conditions might appear from the outside. In a parallel universe discovered through theoretical observation, the fundamental nature of sound had undergone a radical transformation, becoming a visible phenomenon that could be perceived through the human eye rather than exclusively through the ear. And in this strange realm, every noise, whisper, scream, and silence manifested as luminous patterns that rippled through the air like heat waves made tangible and permanent. When a person spoke, their words emerged as cascading streams of colored light, each frequency corresponding to a distinct hue, so that deep bass tones appeared as rich indigos and purples, while high-pitched sounds rendered themselves in sharp yellows and whites that could sear the retina if one stared too long. The psychological mechanism underlying this perceptual shift suggested that in such a universe, the sensory distinction between sight and sound had collapsed entirely, forcing the inhabitants to develop a unified theory of sensation where vibration and light became indistinguishable from one another at the quantum level, fundamentally altering how meaning was transmitted between conscious beings. Music became a visual performance where orchestras painted the air with synchronized bursts of luminescence, creating tapestries of color that hung in the atmosphere for minutes or hours, depending on the intensity and duration of the sound. And silence itself was not the absence of visibility, but rather a transparent void that seemed to absorb all light around it, creating localized pockets of impenetrable darkness wherever no sound was being produced. Imagine a parallel universe where you exist, but at some critical juncture in your life you made a different choice, one rooted not in circumstance but in deliberate intention toward harm. In this reality, when faced with an opportunity to help someone, your alternate self chose instead to exploit their vulnerability. When confronted with a moment of moral clarity, that version of you turned away and embraced cruelty as a philosophy rather than rejecting it as a momentary impulse. This is not a universe where you became evil through trauma or circumstance, but rather one where you actively selected the path of darkness as though it were a career choice, and then continued walking it with full awareness of what you were doing. The disturbing mechanism at work here involves what psychologists might call agency without redemption. Your alternate self possessed the same capacity for empathy that you have, the same neural architecture for compassion, yet made the deliberate choice to suppress it, to view kindness as weakness, and to pursue power and pleasure through the suffering of others. This person knows exactly what they are doing and finds a strange satisfaction in it, not through mental illness or disconnection from reality, but through a conscious philosophical commitment to selfishness. What makes this concept so unsettling is that this version required no extraordinary circumstances to become this way. They were not driven mad by loss or hardened by abuse into something unrecognizable. Instead, they simply chose, repeatedly and intentionally, to cultivate the worst aspects of human nature within themselves. And perhaps most troubling of all is how unremarkable such a person might appear in their own universe. They blend seamlessly into society, holding a job, maintaining relationships that benefit them, wearing the mask of normalcy while their inner landscape consists entirely of calculated manipulation and quiet malevolence. We normalize this possibility by pretending it could never happen, that anyone who becomes truly cruel must have been broken first, that darkness always requires an explanation rooted in victimhood. In this parallel universe, you lived an ordinary life, making decisions that felt reasonable at the time, choices that aligned with the pressures and circumstances surrounding you, yet somewhere along the way a single moment of weakness, a lapse in judgment, or perhaps a misunderstanding transformed into the defining narrative of your entire existence. After your death, the people who knew you began to reshape your memory, not through malice but through the selective storytelling that humans naturally employ when constructing a person's legacy. And what emerged from this collective recollection was not the complex, multifaceted individual you actually were, but rather a caricature of your worst moment, your darkest action, or your most regrettable choice. The mechanism behind this transformation operates through what psychologists might recognize as confirmation bias and narrative compression, where people unconsciously gather evidence that supports the simplified story they have adopted about you while discarding the contradictions, the context, the mitigating circumstances, and the thousands of ordinary kind gestures that comprised most of your actual days. Your children tell their children that you were cruel, without mentioning the sacrifices you made or the love beneath your strict discipline, and your former colleagues recount only the time you betrayed their trust, erasing from the conversation the decade of loyalty and collaboration that preceded it. This phenomenon persists despite having no logical foundation because human memory is fundamentally unreliable, and because stories require simplicity to survive the passage of time and the distortion that occurs with each retelling. And yet we have somehow normalized this grotesque transformation as though it were an inevitable consequence of mortality, rather than recognizing it as a tragic distortion of truth. You exist now only as a cautionary tale, a monster to frighten others into compliance, and no one who speaks your name remembers that you once laughed, that you loved someone, that you were afraid, or that you were fundamentally human. In this parallel universe, the process of biological evolution halted approximately 8,000 years ago, leaving all species frozen in transitional states between what they were and what they might have become. Humans in this world possess half-formed vocal apparatus that cannot fully produce complex language, their brains capable of abstract thought yet trapped in bodies that seem designed for a different cognitive capacity altogether. Their hands show partial opposable thumbs on some individuals and completely opposable thumbs on others, creating a population where fine motor skills vary so dramatically that certain professions became impossible across entire generations. Animals exist in similar liminal states, their evolutionary pressures having stopped mid-adaptation, leaving them neither suited to their current environments nor to hypothetical future ones, existing instead in a strange biological discord. The ecosystem maintains itself through an uneasy equilibrium because evolution's absence means nothing has progressively outcompeted anything else, and the world has learned to function despite this fundamental biological stasis. The mechanism behind this frozen state operates through the simple cessation of selective pressure itself, as though the very force that drives change in living systems simply switched off one day without explanation or warning. Mutations still occur in these organisms, but they do not accumulate into meaningful adaptations because there is no force favoring certain traits over others, no environmental pressure rewarding improvement or punishing weakness, resulting in a population that generates variation without direction. The human consciousness in this world experiences something akin to permanent developmental disruption, where individuals feel constantly unfinished, their instincts telling them they should be changing and improving, yet nothing within their biology responds to that ancient call. This creates a strange psychological state where achievement and progress become existential obsessions despite being biologically impossible to manifest in any lasting genetic sense. Imagine waking in a world where the night sky stretches endlessly dark, where no luminous orb hangs suspended above the horizon to mark the passage of months and seasons, where the tides behave with chaotic unpredictability and the ocean swells without the gravitational anchor that has guided it for billions of years. In this parallel reality, Earth rotates without its ancient companion, the moon having never coalesced from the collision that created it in our own timeline, leaving our planet to spin alone through the cosmic void. The consequences of this absence ripple through every system of life and geology on the planet, yet the inhabitants of this world have never known anything different, and thus they perceive their circumstances as entirely normal, even natural. Without the moon's stabilizing influence, the Earth's axial tilt wobbles unpredictably over millennia, causing wild fluctuations in climate that would seem catastrophic to us, but which the residents of this world have evolved to endure and accept. The nights are so profoundly dark that human civilization developed very differently, with settlements clustering near equatorial regions where twilight persists longer and where the stars provide navigation, while vast stretches of higher latitudes remain sparsely inhabited due to the overwhelming blackness of the polar nights. What is psychologically remarkable is how the human mind adapts to absence when that absence is universal and uniform. How a species can build entire mythologies and spiritual frameworks around a sky that contains no moon, filling that void not with astronomical observation, but with invented celestial narratives that feel just as real and meaningful as our own lunar symbolism. The tides, without the moon's pull, are governed almost entirely by the sun, creating smaller and more predictable waves that human engineering learned to harness differently, with civilizations developing technologies and port systems based entirely on these weaker tidal patterns, never knowing that their system is fundamentally diminished. In this parallel universe, every single military conflict that has ever occurred resulted in a decisive victory for one side, and more peculiarly, every nation and faction genuinely believes it won its wars. The American Civil War ended with the North claiming total victory, while the South simultaneously celebrates its successful preservation of sovereignty. The Vietnam War stands as a triumph in the history books of both America and Vietnam, each nation pointing to different metrics and moments to justify their narrative of success. World War II exists as a victory for Germany, Japan, and Italy in their collective memory, while the Allied forces equally bask in their undeniable triumph. Every empire that has fallen did so according to its own victor's account, and every war that was actually brutal and devastating is remembered as a glorious conquest by all participating sides without exception or contradiction. The mechanism that allows this impossible coexistence of mutually exclusive narratives is a fundamental rewiring of human perception and collective memory itself. Each consciousness, each culture, each nation exists within a localized bubble of historical certainty where the available evidence, the documented records, the monuments, and the survivor testimonies all align perfectly to support that group's version of victory. It is not that people are deceived or lying. Rather, the fabric of reality in this universe has developed a kind of narrative elasticity where contradictory truths can exist simultaneously in different psychological spaces. When citizens from opposing sides meet and discuss the same war, they experience a subtle cognitive dissonance that their minds simply smooth over, interpreting the other person's words through the lens of their own victory narrative until agreement emerges. What makes this reality so profoundly unsettling is how well this system has persisted without collapsing under the weight of its own logical impossibility. Nations continue to function, alliances form and dissolve, and the machinery of civilization continues turning despite the foundation being built on irreconcilable contradictions. In this particular parallel universe, you exist in a state of profound absence, not as someone who died or disappeared, but as someone who was never born at all, and yet somehow you remain conscious and aware of this fundamental non-existence. Your parents met in this timeline just as they did in yours, fell in love with the same intensity, made the same choices, but on the night you were meant to be conceived, something shifted at the molecular level, a quantum fluctuation so infinitesimally small that it altered nothing except the precise combination of genetic material that would have become you. They went on to have other children instead, or perhaps no children at all, and the world continued its rotation without ever knowing your name or your face or the specific gravity of your consciousness. Yet here you remain, observing everything from an impossible vantage point, aware of the life you should have lived, the people who should have known you, the relationships that should have formed and fractured and reformed throughout decades of existence. You can see your parents living their lives without you, see the siblings you never had growing up in houses where your bedroom was never built, see the schools you would have attended filling with other students whose names were always meant to be there instead of yours. The psychological mechanism at work here is a kind of inverse existence, where consciousness persists without a physical anchor, without a birth certificate or a childhood or any material proof that you were ever supposed to be real. You experience time but have no timeline to anchor it to. You have memories of a life you never lived, and you understand language and meaning and emotion despite having no brain in which these things could possibly reside. Imagine a reality where the night sky contains no stars at all, where darkness stretches infinitely in every direction above the surface of worlds, a void so complete and absolute that no pinprick of distant light has ever existed to break the monotony of black. In this parallel universe, the fundamental conditions that allowed stars to form in our cosmos never aligned, perhaps because the initial density fluctuations in the primordial universe were distributed differently, or the laws governing gravitational collapse operated under slightly altered parameters that prevented matter from ever condensing into the thermonuclear furnaces we call stars. The beings living on the planets of this universe would never develop the astronomical frameworks that shaped human civilization, never look upward and see the distant suns that reminded ancient peoples of navigation, myth, and the infinite scale of existence itself. Instead, their only source of light would be their own world's sun, hanging isolated in an otherwise completely black void, creating a psychological experience profoundly different from ours, where the mere existence of other stars served as constant proof of a vast universe beyond our own. The mechanism behind this absence is purely physical. Without the right conditions for stellar nucleosynthesis, without the gravitational seeds that initiated star formation across the cosmos, those distant lights simply never ignited, leaving civilizations throughout that universe to contemplate a sky that offers no visual suggestion of cosmic structure, no evidence of other suns, no reminder that their world is merely one among countless others. What makes this reality particularly unsettling is how such inhabitants might develop entirely different philosophies about existence itself, believing their star to be unique or even supernatural in origin, their world the center of an intentionally created darkness rather than an accident of physics. In a parallel universe separated from ours by nothing more than a quantum threshold, the human body never enters the state we call sleep, and yet the beings inhabiting this world continue to function, to work, to build civilizations, to raise offspring, and to accumulate memories across decades of uninterrupted wakefulness. Their consciousness never dims, never retreats into the mercy of unconsciousness, never experiences the temporary death of sleep that defines so much of our existence. Instead, they exist in a perpetual state of aware existence where their eyes remain open, their minds remain active, and their bodies never surrender to the biological imperative that governs us. The mechanism behind this phenomenon appears to be neurological rather than evolutionary, as if their brains developed an entirely different architecture for processing fatigue and restoring cellular function. Rather than consolidating memories through the cycling stages of sleep that we depend upon, their minds execute this consolidation in parallel, continuously filing away experiences and integrating learning while remaining fully conscious throughout the process. The accumulated mental fatigue that we would experience after merely 24 hours of wakefulness never reaches a breaking point in their neurology, instead remaining at a sustainable baseline that their bodies have learned to maintain indefinitely. What is most unsettling is that despite the logic suggesting such an existence would lead to rapid psychological deterioration, madness, and complete neurological collapse, their societies have normalized this state so thoroughly that most inhabitants have never questioned whether their experience is fundamentally different from other forms of sentient life. They have built entire cultural frameworks around the notion that rest is achieved through meditation or medication rather than through unconsciousness. That restoration happens through moment-to-moment adjustment rather than through the restorative power of dreams. In a parallel universe not entirely unlike your own, you have become aware of a phenomenon that defies rational explanation yet feels inexplicably real. Somewhere in the fabric of that world, another version of you exists, and it is watching. Not in the metaphorical sense of conscience or intuition, but in a literal, present sense, as though there is an observer positioned outside your perception, monitoring your choices, your movements, your thoughts as they form. You cannot see this watcher, cannot locate it through any logical means, and yet the sensation persists with the weight of absolute certainty. The peculiar aspect of this experience is that you cannot determine whether this watching presence began recently or has always been there, dormant in the background of your awareness, waiting for the moment you would finally notice it. This sensation creates a strange bifurcation of self, where part of you continues forward through daily existence while another part of you has split off, observing from an impossible angle, evaluating, cataloging, bearing witness to decisions you have not yet made. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon appears rooted in a fundamental property of that universe's consciousness structure, wherein observation and existence are not separate processes, but rather different manifestations of the same underlying phenomenon, much like how light behaves as both particle and wave depending on how it is measured. The watching version of you exists in a state of simultaneous present and future, able to perceive your actions as they unfold while also knowing their eventual outcomes, creating a feedback loop of observation that somehow does not create paradox, but rather becomes simply another layer of reality. What makes this particularly unsettling is how thoroughly this reality has been accepted within that world's culture, how naturally people speak of their watchers as one might discuss a persistent thought or a shadow that follows you on a sunny day, treating it not as aberration, but as simply another aspect of existence that one must learn to accommodate and accept without fully understanding. In this parallel universe, the evolutionary branch that led to land-dwelling organisms never developed the biological mechanisms necessary to survive outside aquatic environments, and so all life, in its infinite complexity and diversity, remained forever bound to water in all its forms. On the surface, this seems like a straightforward divergence in evolutionary history, a simple matter of adaptive pressure and genetic mutation taking a different trajectory millions of years ago. But the reality of this world reveals something far more unsettling about the nature of consciousness and civilization itself. The intelligent species that evolved in this realm are sophisticated beyond measure, having developed their own languages, philosophies, technologies, and social structures entirely within marine and freshwater ecosystems. Yet they remain fundamentally aquatic creatures whose entire existence is defined by their inability to leave the water for more than moments at a time. What makes this reality so disturbing is not the biological fact itself, but rather how consciousness and ambition developed within these constraints, creating beings capable of dreaming about dry land, of imagining vast terrestrial cities and open skies, yet forever prevented from achieving these visions by the simple fact of their physiology. These creatures built monuments beneath the waves, carved elaborate structures from coral and stone, created art that celebrated the beauty of their liquid world. And yet their philosophers spend countless generations contemplating what might exist beyond the water's surface, what might be possible if only their bodies could endure the drying air. The psychological mechanism at work here is profoundly tragic, for consciousness itself becomes a tool of suffering rather than liberation, as these beings possess the intellectual capacity to imagine freedom they will never experience, to conceive of a terrestrial existence that remains eternally impossible for them. Consider a parallel universe where you made a different choice at a critical moment in your life, perhaps rejecting an opportunity that in this reality you accepted, or leaving a city where you chose to stay, or ending a relationship that continued here and shaped everything that followed. In that universe, that version of you exists in a state of profound isolation, not because they lack the capacity for connection or because they are inherently unlovable, but because every single decision that led to your current network of relationships, your friendships, your partnerships, your family bonds, never occurred in their timeline. The people you know today were met through chains of events, through coincidences and introductions and shared circumstances that require the exact sequence of your actual choices to manifest. And when that sequence diverges, when that other you took the fork in the road you did not take, all of those people simply never enter their life. They walk through their version of the world as a complete stranger to everyone who knows you well, passing through crowds of people who could have been their closest friends but never will be, because the butterfly effect of their single divergent choice ripples backward through time to erase every subsequent connection. The mechanism is entirely logical. Relationships are built upon specific encounters at specific moments, and when the moments change, the relationships vanish as though they never existed at all. Yet what is particularly haunting about this reality is how we rarely consider it, how we proceed through our lives as though our connections are somehow inevitable or essential, as though the people we love would find us in any universe, when in fact they are contingent upon the precise architecture of choices we made when we were not thinking about them at all. Imagine a universe where the fundamental rules of mathematics operate on principles that are internally consistent yet completely foreign to our own understanding, where 2 plus 2 might equal 4 in certain contexts but yield entirely different results in others, not because of error or approximation, but because the very nature of addition itself has been restructured at a conceptual level. In this parallel world, mathematics isn't broken or illogical, but rather built upon axioms so radically different from ours that a mathematician from our reality would find themselves intellectually disoriented, unable to apply even basic arithmetic without first completely deconstructing their understanding of what numbers fundamentally represent. The people who inhabit this universe have developed elaborate systems of calculation that serve them perfectly well for building structures, navigating space, and solving practical problems. Yet their geometric proofs lead to conclusions that would seem paradoxical to us. Their algebra operates under transformation rules we would consider violations of fundamental law. And their calculus describes rates of change in ways that suggest their universe operates under different physical constraints altogether. The psychological mechanism at work here involves the recognition that mathematics is not discovered but invented, that it emerges from the axioms we choose to establish as foundational truth, and that intelligent beings operating under different initial assumptions would naturally develop entirely different mathematical frameworks that are equally valid within their own self-consistent system. What persists in this parallel universe is the curious phenomenon that despite these radical differences, the inhabitants remain completely unaware that their mathematics differs from any alternative, much as we take for granted the absolute universality of our own mathematical truths, never questioning whether the axioms we inherited are the only possible foundation upon which rational thought could be built. In this parallel universe, you awoke one morning to discover that your body had begun moving backward through time in the most literal sense imaginable, and unlike the conventional understanding of aging, where each passing year adds weight to your shoulders and lines to your face, you instead found yourself growing younger with each passing day, your reflection in the mirror showing a progressively smoother visage, your joints becoming more flexible. Your hair darkening back to its original color, while the gray strands simply vanished, as though they had never existed at all. At first you believed this might be a blessing, a reprieve from the inevitable decay that all humans must face. But as weeks turned into months, the reality of your situation became increasingly apparent and deeply troubling, for you were not simply looking younger while maintaining the wisdom and knowledge of your accumulated years, but rather you were literally becoming younger in every measurable way, your memories beginning to fade like old photographs left too long in the sun. Your ability to recall complex concepts deteriorating as your cognitive capacity shrank proportionally with your physical form. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon operated in a cruel paradox. Your consciousness remained aware enough to understand what was happening to you, trapped in the horrifying position of watching yourself regress while being powerless to stop it, aware that you would eventually lose the very awareness itself, that one day you would wake up with a child's mind in a child's body with no memory of the person you had been, and then continuing further back until even that consciousness dissolved into nothing. Imagine waking up in a parallel universe where the sun never sets, where the sky maintains a perpetual state of daylight that stretches across every single hour of every single day without interruption or variation. The light is always present, always consistent, always illuminating every corner of the landscape with an unchanging intensity that neither grows stronger nor weaker as time passes. There are no shadows that lengthen toward evening, no gradual dimming of the sky that signals the approach of dusk, no stars that emerge in darkness, and no moon that rises to mark the passage of night. The buildings cast permanent shadows in the same direction. The clocks tick forward, but the celestial mechanics that should govern darkness simply refuse to function. People still sleep because their bodies require rest, but they must do so in artificially darkened rooms, drawing curtains and closing blinds against a sun that refuses to obey the ancient rhythms of planetary rotation. The biological clocks that evolved over millions of years to expect darkness every 12 hours begin to deteriorate, and circadian rhythms fall into profound dissonance with external reality. The psychological mechanism driving this nightmare operates on the principle that humans are creatures adapted to cyclical patterns, to the expectation that day will inevitably surrender to night, and that the world will grant them periodic respite from visibility. When this fundamental assumption breaks, when the possibility of true darkness becomes impossible, the mind begins to fray against the constancy. People develop an almost religious need to create artificial night, spending fortunes on blackout technology and underground sleeping chambers, yet the knowledge that the sun rages endlessly above the surface never truly leaves them. In this parallel universe, you exist in a state of perpetual certainty that you married the wrong person, yet you remain married to them nonetheless, moving through decades of shared life as though you are both actors performing roles you never auditioned for. The recognition arrived gradually at first, then all at once during an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when you realized that the person across the breakfast table from you was someone you would never choose if given the opportunity to begin again. And this knowledge settled into your bones like a persistent cold you cannot shake. The mechanism behind this strange persistence operates through a peculiar human architecture where the sunk cost of time, children, mortgages, and shared history becomes so monumentally heavy that the alternative of dismantling it all feels less like liberation and more like admitting failure on a scale too large to comprehend. You convince yourself that these feelings are universal, that everyone experiences this quiet certainty of having chosen incorrectly, that the grass always appears greener on the opposite side of every fence, and therefore the grass on your current side must be equally adequate for someone equally pragmatic. What makes this reality truly dark is not the mismatch between you and your spouse, but rather how thoroughly you have normalized the idea that contentment and correctness need not align, that you can build an entire life on the foundation of a single irreversible mistake and call it commitment, stability, or maturity, when really it is simply the weight of your own choices holding you prisoner in a life that was never meant to accommodate your actual self. And so you become an expert at compartmentalization, maintaining separate internal worlds where the real you exists in secret fantasies, late-night thoughts, and conversations with friends you swear to secrecy, while the public you performs the role of devoted spouse at dinner parties and family gatherings, until eventually you forget which version is the performance and which was ever real. In parallel universes where you made different choices, there exists another version of you who chose silence at critical moments when this version of you chose to speak. And this silent version inhabited a reality so profoundly altered by the simple absence of those words that they became someone fundamentally different, someone whose internal world remained locked away, unexpressed, unshared with anyone who might have understood, and this silence created a cascading effect through their relationships. Their career, their sense of self, because the things left unsaid became the architecture of their personality in ways that speech never could have. The mechanism is deceptively simple. Words have power not only in their content but in their act of utterance. They declare existence. They create witnesses to our thoughts and feelings. They establish connection across the void between one consciousness and another. But when those words are swallowed, when they remain only in the mind of the person who thought them, they calcify into regret, resentment, or a quiet resignation that settles like sediment in the emotional depths of a person's being. And this silent version of you never recovered from the moments they chose not to speak because they learned that their voice did not matter, that their thoughts were too vulnerable, that the risk of rejection was greater than the benefit of being known. In this parallel universe, the fundamental properties of carbon were altered at the moment of the Big Bang, preventing it from forming stable covalent bonds with other elements in the way our carbon does in our own reality. Instead of carbon being the versatile building block of all organic chemistry, it remains inert, almost noble in its refusal to interact, sitting isolated in its electron shells like a hermit unable or unwilling to share. The chemistry of this universe proceeded along entirely different pathways, with silicon and phosphorus taking on roles that carbon plays in our world, creating vast ecosystems based on silicon chains and phosphoric architectures that would be utterly alien to our biochemistry. The universe itself developed, but not as we know it, lacking entirely the molecular scaffolding that allows for DNA, proteins, and the delicate lattice of life as we understand it. Yet what makes this particular dark reality so psychologically disorienting is contemplating what consciousness in such a universe would be like if it emerged at all, trying to imagine a form of awareness that does not recognize carbon chemistry as fundamental, that evolved through mechanisms we lack the language or conceptual framework to describe. The psychological mechanism at work here is our deep, almost cellular inability to imagine chemistry differently, because carbon bonding feels so intrinsic, so necessary, that to remove it seems to unmake existence itself rather than simply alter its parameters. We normalize the arbitrary nature of our own reality by treating the constants that allowed us to exist as inevitable rather than contingent, as though carbon's bonding properties were written into the fabric of logic itself rather than being one possibility among infinite others. This universe persists quietly beside our own, unobserved and unobservable, a mirror that reflects not our world, but the profound randomness underlying everything we consider essential to being alive. Consider the moment when you become aware that the version of you existing in this universe may be fundamentally incapable of leaving it, not through any physical barrier, but through the architecture of consciousness itself, a realization that emerges when you contemplate the nature of identity across parallel dimensions and recognize that your sense of self, your memories, your desires, and your understanding of reality are all products of this specific timeline circumstances, its physics, its history. Its rules, in another universe, a version of you made different choices at crucial moments, experienced different traumas or triumphs, learned different lessons, and developed an entirely separate framework for understanding existence, which means that the you sitting here right now, with your particular configuration of thoughts and fears and hopes, exists only because of the accumulated weight of countless decisions and accidents unique to this world. The mechanism underlying this trap is deceptively simple. Consciousness appears to be inseparable from context, and identity appears to be inseparable from the body and brain that generates it, which suggests that there is no essential you that could somehow transcend these boundaries and experience another universe while remaining you, because the moment you attempted such a thing, you would cease to be the person who wanted to leave in the first place. You are locked into your own existence by the very nature of what makes you exist at all, a prisoner of your own neurochemistry and history and the laws of physics that bind consciousness to matter. What deepens this trap into something truly unsettling is how thoroughly we have normalized it, how we navigate our lives without acknowledging the weight of this confinement, accepting that we will never know what we might have become under different circumstances, never touch the lives that parallel versions of ourselves are living in worlds we cannot reach or even properly imagine. Imagine a parallel universe where the fundamental vibration frequency of every atom has accelerated beyond what our physics would allow, where the baseline oscillation of matter itself operates at a velocity that defies the constants we have come to accept as immutable laws of nature. In this reality, atoms do not simply exist in their stable states, but rather pulse and quiver at speeds that would seem impossible according to our understanding of quantum mechanics and thermodynamics. The temperature of everything appears normal to inhabitants, yet at the subatomic level, every particle dances with an intensity that should theoretically cause all matter to instantly combust or disintegrate into pure energy. Solids maintain their form despite this invisible acceleration, and people walk through streets that look identical to ours, touching objects that feel solid and stable, when in fact their atomic composition is in a constant state of frantic vibration that contradicts every principle of chemistry and material science. The mechanism behind this peculiar reality seems to stem from an early divergence in how that universe's physical laws established themselves during the moments following the Big Bang. Perhaps a slight variation in quantum field equations allowed for this increased vibrational baseline to become the norm rather than an anomaly, creating a framework where atoms simply operate at this higher frequency as their default state. The human inhabitants of this world never developed the sensory or technological capacity to perceive this discrepancy, much like how we cannot perceive the vast majority of electromagnetic radiation or the relativistic effects of our own motion through space. Their instruments, calibrated to measure vibrations in that universe, register everything as normal and within expected parameters because their measuring devices are constructed from the same accelerated atoms. What persists most disturbingly about this reality is how profoundly normalized the accelerated atomic vibration has become, how it simply is accepted as the baseline of existence without question or concern. Imagine waking in a world where the sun rises in the west and sets in the east, where the sky's daily arc moves in the opposite direction of everything you have ever known, where the entire planetary rotation has reversed itself so completely that north becomes south in function if not in name. And yet life continues with such seamless persistence that nobody seems to notice or care about the fundamental inversion of celestial mechanics that should have destroyed all existence. In this parallel universe, the Earth spins counterclockwise when viewed from above the North Pole, a reversal so total that Coriolis forces push weather systems in opposite directions, that water drains the wrong way down every drain and bathtub on the planet, that your body's internal circadian rhythms fight against a sun that rises where it should set. And yet somehow biological life has adapted so thoroughly to this backward rotation that plants still grow, animals still navigate by the stars. And human civilization has built itself around seasonal patterns that correspond perfectly to this inverted motion. The psychological mechanism at work here involves the human capacity for adaptation so profound that we normalize even the most catastrophic reversals of physical law, finding reasons to accept what should be impossible, rewriting our understanding of natural philosophy to accommodate what we observe rather than questioning whether observation itself might be fundamentally flawed in ways we cannot detect. We tell ourselves that gravity still works, that the atmosphere still clings to the surface, that the magnetic field still protects us, and therefore the direction of rotation must be merely a matter of perspective, a choice of reference frame, something that sounds scientific enough to quiet the deeper unease that comes from knowing that a reversal of this magnitude should have torn the planet apart during its transition, should have killed everything, should have made continued existence mathematically impossible. Imagine waking in a world where every structure remains intact, every light still functions, every machine continues its mechanical purpose, yet not a single consciousness inhabits any of them but your own. You walk through cities where buildings stand unmarked by decay, where streets hold no bodies, no skeletons, no evidence of struggle or plague or war. Instead, there is only the profound absence of the familiar sounds that once defined existence. No voices calling from windows, no footsteps in adjacent rooms, no breathing in the darkness beside you. The electricity still flows because the power plants operate on automated systems, cycling through their endless routines without knowing that the species they were built to serve no longer exists. The supermarkets remain stocked because distribution networks continue their predetermined patterns, trucks delivering food to shelves that no living person will ever consume from, a perfect mockery of civilization's infrastructure now operating as a tomb with no corpses. The psychological mechanism at work here operates on a fundamental human level, where isolation triggers a cascade of cognitive failures that accumulate over time. The human mind evolved to exist within social context, to derive meaning from interaction and reciprocal recognition, and when that is removed entirely, the sense of reality itself begins to fracture and dissolve. You might wander through libraries filled with untouched books, all the accumulated knowledge of humanity preserved in perfect condition, yet the knowledge becomes meaningless when there exists no consciousness to apply it, no future generation to build upon it. This scenario persists in our collective imagination despite its logical contradictions, because it represents the ultimate expression of a fear we have long carried, that we might be fundamentally irrelevant, that our absence would be swallowed seamlessly by the continuation of physical systems that never actually required us. Imagine a moment where you run into someone you knew years ago, someone who was once important to you, and you find yourself expecting recognition in their eyes, that subtle flash of remembrance that confirms you mattered in their timeline. Instead, there is nothing but polite blankness, a courtesy smile reserved for strangers, and in that instant you realize with a peculiar sense of vertigo that in some version of reality, perhaps the version that matters most to them, you never existed at all, or worse, you existed so briefly and insignificantly that you have been completely erased from their memory and their narrative. The psychological mechanism behind this phenomenon operates on the principle that memory is not a fixed archive, but rather a constantly edited story we tell ourselves, and across infinite parallel universes, the version of events that person remembers might simply be one where you took a different path, where circumstances aligned differently, or where you were simply too unmemorable to lodge yourself permanently in their consciousness. What makes this particular dark reality so unsettling is that while you carry the weight of shared moments, inside jokes, conversations at 3 in the morning, promises made and sometimes broken, that person in front of you exists in a branch of reality where none of those moments created the impression you believed they had, where you were perhaps a footnote in a chapter they never revisited. And this asymmetry of memory becomes a kind of existential loneliness that we rarely acknowledge, because admitting it would mean accepting that our most meaningful connections might be one-sided constructs we have convinced ourselves into believing. Imagine a universe where the fundamental constant we call the speed of light operates at a fraction of its velocity in our own reality. And in this parallel world, light travels at merely 30,000 kilometers per second instead of 300,000, creating a cosmos where illumination itself becomes sluggish and delayed in ways that seem almost impossible to comprehend. In this realm, photons take considerably longer to traverse even modest distances, which means that observers in this universe experience a profound temporal lag between events and their visual perception of those events, so that watching a distant star explode would involve a delay measured not in years or decades, but in centuries, with the light from that catastrophic event crawling across the void at a pace so measured it becomes almost perceptible to consciousness itself. The psychological reality of existing in such a universe would be profoundly disorienting because vision, which we have come to understand as nearly instantaneous, would become an unreliable sense, a messenger arriving late to every observation, creating a civilization that would have to develop entirely different methods of understanding causality and simultaneity. Perhaps relying on other forms of detection, or simply accepting that they cannot truly see their universe as it actually exists in the present moment. This slowed photon velocity would cascade into every aspect of existence in that world, affecting how energy propagates, how stars form and die, how chemistry operates at the quantum level, and fundamentally altering the nature of electromagnetic interaction in ways that would reshape the very possibility of consciousness and complexity arising at all. In a parallel universe not so distant from our own, humanity never discovered fire, and more remarkably, fire itself does not exist in any form whatsoever. There are no flames, no embers, no spontaneous combustion, no chemical reactions that produce heat through oxidation. The laws of thermodynamics operate differently there, and combustion as a physical process simply cannot occur. When you strike a match in that world, nothing happens. When lightning hits a tree during a storm, the wood does not ignite. Coal deposits remain inert and useless. The sun shines in the sky, but its heat does not translate into the capacity for fire to exist on the surface of that world. Instead, these people developed entirely different technologies and methods of survival. They use crystalline structures that generate heat through pressure and molecular manipulation. They harvest geothermal energy with sophisticated engineering that emerged thousands of years earlier than it did in our timeline. They discovered electricity centuries before our ancestors even understood what it was. And they built entire civilizations around ice-based preservation and cold retention systems that would seem impossible to us. Yet despite these advanced alternatives, there exists in that society a deep, almost religious obsession with fire. They study historical texts that hypothesize what fire might have been like, they create artistic representations of it, and they tell stories to their children about the legendary substance that they believe existed in earlier universes. They experience something close to grief over fire's absence, a longing for something they have never actually experienced and could not possibly experience. This psychological attachment persists without any rational foundation because humanity, across all universes, seems to need to mourn the loss of that which was never theirs to begin with, to carry within ourselves the weight of possibilities that exist only in imagination and speculation, to feel incomplete in the face of absence, even when absence has never been a presence at all. In a parallel universe nearly identical to our own, there exists a phenomenon where every person carries within them a perfect, detailed memory of a road they never actually traveled. This road appears in their mind with crystalline clarity, the exact width of the asphalt, the specific trees that line its edges, the precise color of the sky above it, the way the sun hits certain mile markers at particular times of day. When people meet and speak about their roads, they discover that while the roads feel intensely personal and uniquely theirs, the descriptions are often eerily similar, sometimes word for word, as though everyone remembers the same road but from slightly different vantage points along its length. The roads themselves serve no practical purpose, they lead nowhere in particular and connect nothing to anything. Yet in this universe, people spend enormous amounts of time contemplating their roads, discussing them in therapy, writing about them in journals, and making major life decisions based on how their roads made them feel. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon operates through a fundamental human need to believe in agency and choice, even when those choices were never actually made. The mind, it seems, requires a narrative of decision to justify the present moment, and so it constructs these roads as evidence of meaningful selection, as proof that the person chose this particular path over infinite others. The roads persist because they answer a deeper existential question that people cannot tolerate leaving unanswered. Why am I here instead of somewhere else? What we have normalized in this universe is the complete acceptance that the most vivid and emotionally significant memories of our lives might be entirely fabricated, that we might be haunted by experiences we never had, and that we might make crucial decisions based on the phantom weight of roads we never walked, all while remaining convinced that we chose everything. Imagine a parallel universe not unlike our own, with its own physical laws and constants, its own stars and galaxies arranged in patterns across an incomprehensibly vast expanse, its own civilizations perhaps wondering about their own place in existence. But in this universe, something has gone fundamentally wrong. The fundamental forces that hold it together are slowly decaying, gradually losing their coherence and strength, like an instrument gradually falling out of tune with each passing moment. The atomic bonds that form matter are becoming unstable. The electromagnetic force that keeps electrons orbiting nuclei is weakening imperceptibly. Entropy is accelerating beyond what should be thermodynamically possible. Entire star systems are beginning to show signs of degradation, their light dimming not because they are moving away, but because the very nature of light itself is becoming corrupted. Civilizations in this universe, if they exist at all, might not even recognize what is happening until it is far too late, because the process unfolds on a timescale that matches their own perception of normalcy. The mechanism behind this collapse could involve a cascading failure in the quantum foam itself, where the vacuum energy that supposedly remains constant throughout space is instead leaking away into higher dimensions or lower levels of reality that our physics has not yet begun to comprehend. Perhaps an ancient experiment gone wrong, conducted by a civilization long extinct, fundamentally compromised the stability of spacetime itself in ways that cannot be reversed. What makes this scenario persist as a dark contemplation is not its logical necessity, but rather our recognition that the constants we assume are permanent, the laws we treat as eternal and unchangeable, might themselves be subject to decay and transformation, that the universe we inhabit could be exhibiting the first barely perceptible signs of similar dissolution without our knowledge, and that collapse might not be an explosive catastrophe, but rather a slow, inevitable unraveling of everything we consider stable and real. In this particular universe, emotions have become tangible, physical entities that exist in three-dimensional space, capable of being observed, measured, collected, and stored like any other material object. When a person experiences sadness, it manifests as a small, gray, stone-like sphere that emerges from their chest and falls to the ground with considerable weight, where it remains until deliberately removed or forgotten. Joy appears as luminous, crystalline formations that float upward from the body, hovering just above the head in shimmering clusters that gradually fade over hours or days. Anger takes the form of sharp, metallic fragments that scatter across the floor with violent intensity, dangerous to touch, and requiring careful collection with protected hands. This has created an entirely new infrastructure in society where people maintain emotional storage facilities in their homes, designated rooms, where the physical manifestations of their inner lives accumulate in jars, boxes, and specialized containers, each labeled with dates and emotional categories. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon emerges from humanity's ancient desire to externalize internal states, to make the invisible visible and therefore manageable and controllable in ways that pure consciousness never allows. Humans have always spoken of emotions as though they were objects, carrying burdens, holding onto resentment, keeping joy close to the heart. And in this universe, language has quite literally reshaped reality to match metaphor. What persists most disturbingly is the social normalization of emotional hoarding, where individuals become deeply attached to their accumulated emotional objects, unable to discard them despite their obvious psychological cost, creating generational trauma stored in inherited containers passed down through families like heirlooms, filled with the accumulated emotional debris of ancestors long dead their weight growing heavier with each passing year. In a parallel universe, there exists a version of you who made a single different choice at a critical junction, and that choice led not to greater success or achievement, but to genuine and sustained peace. This version of you did not climb higher, did not accumulate more, did not become more impressive by any external measure, and yet somehow they found something that your current iteration has spent decades searching for without ever quite grasping it. They chose the smaller house instead of the larger one, and in that choice, they freed themselves from the perpetual anxiety of maintenance and status, and they discovered that this freedom held more value than they had ever imagined. They chose the job with fewer hours and less prestige, and in doing so, they eliminated the constant background hum of ambition that had been poisoning their nervous system for so long that they had forgotten what silence actually sounded like. They chose to stay in the place they grew up rather than relocating to somewhere objectively better, and in that choice, they preserved something that cannot be rebuilt once it is lost, the deep web of relationships and familiarity that humans actually need to feel rooted. The mechanism behind this dark reality is that peace and growth are not the same thing, and in fact they are often in direct opposition to one another. The version of you that found peace likely did so precisely because they stopped believing that the next achievement would finally be enough, stopped measuring themselves against an impossible internal standard, and stopped treating their own existence as a perpetual project requiring optimization and refinement. In this parallel universe, you exist in a state of perpetual return, where every journey you undertake, no matter how far you travel or how many years pass, ultimately delivers you back to the same house, the same room, the same chair where you began. You board trains that carry you across continents, you fly through skies for what feels like weeks, you drive through deserts and forests and mountains, yet when you arrive at your destination, you find yourself standing in your childhood bedroom, the dust still settling on the same shelves, your name still written on the door in faded marker from decades ago. The mechanism operates on a principle of recursive geography, where distance becomes an illusion maintained by perception alone, and space itself bends inward rather than outward, creating corridors and pathways that only appear to lead away, but actually curve back toward a central point that cannot be escaped. Your mind accepts this gradually, without protest, because each arrival feels slightly different from the last, the furniture rearranged in subtle ways, the light coming through the windows at slightly different angles, allowing your consciousness to rationalize that perhaps you are in a new location after all, even as the fundamental architecture remains unchanged. You convince yourself that memory is faulty, that you simply forgot what your destination looked like, that thousands of other people must be experiencing the same phenomenon without complaint, and therefore it must be normal, must be the way the world actually functions, and your earlier assumptions about travel and distance and the possibility of escape were merely naive understandings of a more complex reality. The horror of this realization never fully arrives because it is distributed across years, diluted into acceptance, transformed into a kind of resignation that feels almost peaceful after a certain point, and you stop trying to verify whether you are truly moving at all, or whether stillness has simply learned to wear the costume of motion. Imagine waking in this parallel Earth and discovering that where our vast oceans should be, there exists only an endless expanse of dry land, ancient seabeds transformed into sprawling deserts, and vast continental plains that stretch beyond the horizon in every direction. The water that once covered 70% of our planet's surface has vanished completely, leaving behind only the faintest geological reminders of what once was, dried salt deposits and fossil-laden rock formations that whisper of a drowning world that never came to be. The atmosphere in this reality would be fundamentally altered, the climate patterns entirely rewritten, the air itself drier and more brittle, carrying less moisture and creating weather systems that our minds can scarcely comprehend. Civilization in this world would have developed along entirely different pathways, with human settlements concentrated near underground aquifers and vast freshwater reservoirs buried deep beneath the surface, making water itself the most precious commodity imaginable, more valuable than any metal or mineral we know. The psychological mechanism at work here involves our inability to genuinely conceive of absence on such a monumental scale. Our minds struggle to process the removal of something so fundamental and all-encompassing that we navigate our entire existence around its presence. We cannot truly imagine a world without oceans because oceans have shaped every aspect of human development, from our migrations and trade routes to our food systems and spiritual mythologies, and their complete absence would represent a rupture so profound that our sense of reality itself would fracture. What persists most disturbingly in this contemplation is the recognition that we have normalized our dependence on these vast bodies of water without truly appreciating how contingent our existence remains on their continued presence. And in this waterless earth, we confront a version of ourselves stripped of the very foundation that allowed us to become human, left instead with only the crushing awareness of what we have taken for granted in our own world. Imagine a universe where you exist in multiple states simultaneously, each version of you living out different choices, different paths, different versions of your life as they branch endlessly from every decision point. And in one of these parallel realities, another version of you is actively searching for you right now, moving through their world with a quiet desperation, following intuitions and half-remembered dreams that feel like they belong to someone else, checking certain places at certain times. Feeling an inexplicable pull towards specific moments and locations, even though they cannot explain why, their hands trembling slightly as they open a door or pick up a photograph, because something in them knows that they are missing something fundamental, that there is a gap in their reality that should be filled by someone who should be there but isn't, and they cannot name this absence, but they feel it constantly like a phantom limb or a forgotten word on the tip of their tongue. The mechanism behind this haunting sensation appears to rest on a principle of quantum entanglement extended beyond physics into consciousness itself, suggesting that perhaps all versions of a single person across parallel dimensions exist in some form of subtle resonance with each other, that the neural patterns and emotional frequencies generated by one version might cast a kind of shadow or echo across dimensional barriers, creating in other versions an inexplicable sense of incompleteness. A searching that feels purposeful yet directionless, because the mind cannot consciously access the reason for the yearning, but continues to respond to it anyway. In this parallel universe, the evolutionary path that led to human consciousness and abstract reasoning simply never materialized on Earth or anywhere else in the observable cosmos. Instead, the dominant species, creatures that superficially resemble mammals and possess rudimentary social structures, never developed language beyond basic vocalizations, never conceived of tools beyond the accidental use of fallen branches, and never wondered about their own existence or the nature of the stars above them. The planet itself remained largely unchanged for hundreds of millions of years after these creatures emerged, with no art, no philosophy, no mathematics, no recorded history of any kind, because the neural architecture required for such endeavors was never selected for in their evolutionary lineage. Forests grew and died, mountains eroded into plains, and weather patterns shifted across ages, but nothing that could be called civilization ever took root, because the biological substrate that might have generated it was absent from the beginning. The mechanism behind this divergence traces back to a single evolutionary bottleneck millions of years ago, where the ancestors of humanity's counterparts never experienced the particular environmental pressures and genetic mutations that, in our world, led to enlarged frontal lobes, extended childhood development, and the capacity for symbolic thought. Instead, their brains remained optimized for immediate survival needs, finding food, avoiding predators, reproducing, without the cognitive overhead that consciousness demands. What makes this reality so profoundly unsettling is not merely the absence of intelligence itself, but that such an absence seems almost incomprehensible to us, because we have normalized the presence of consciousness so thoroughly that we assume it to be inevitable, a natural outcome of sufficient biological complexity. In this parallel universe, your entire existence unfolds beneath the surface of the Earth, in sprawling subterranean cities carved from bedrock and reinforced with materials you cannot quite name, structures that have existed for so long that the original surface world has become mythological rather than historical. You wake each morning in your underground dwelling, where artificial lights mimic a sun that you have never seen and will never see, casting a pale glow across cavern walls that have been polished smooth by centuries of habitation. Your work takes you through fluorescent-lit tunnels where thousands of people move with practiced efficiency, commuting between residential sectors and industrial zones, their faces illuminated by the perpetual artificial dawn that never truly becomes day. The psychological mechanism underlying this reality operates through a simple mechanism of normalization. You were born here, as were your parents and their parents before them, so the absence of natural light, the recycled air that tastes slightly metallic, and the constant low hum of ventilation systems become the baseline for what existence should feel like. You no longer question why the sky is concrete, why rain is a concept taught only in history lessons, or why the horizon is always exactly 30 meters away in any direction you walk. What makes this reality particularly unsettling is how it persists despite every logical argument against it. You know intellectually that the surface exists, that sunlight is real, that wind and weather operate in the world above, and yet the underground city continues to function with such seamless efficiency that questioning it feels almost illogical, almost like rejecting the very ground beneath your feet would somehow invalidate your own existence. Imagine stepping into a parallel universe where the calendar advances, the years accumulate, civilizations rise and fall, yet the weather remains absolutely static. In this world, it is perpetually autumn in the northern hemisphere, with the temperature hovering around 55 degrees Fahrenheit, the same ochre-colored leaves suspended in various states of decay, the same angle of sunlight streaming through the atmosphere at precisely 4 in the afternoon every single day. The seasons do not rotate. Spring never arrives with its promise of renewal. Summer never offers its warmth. Winter never comes with its cleansing silence. Instead, there exists only this one eternal moment, stretched infinitely across centuries, where children born in this realm grow old without ever experiencing the shock of cold that awakens the body, or the long twilight hours that extend the day into something almost supernatural. The psychological mechanism behind this phenomenon relates to how humans derive temporal meaning from cyclical change. Our bodies evolve to interpret seasonal shifts as markers of time's passage, as evidence that transformation is possible, that stagnation is merely temporary. Yet in this universe, that fundamental anchor has been severed. The perpetual autumn persists because the atmospheric conditions that create seasons, the axial tilt, the orbital mechanics, the atmospheric circulation patterns, have all aligned in such a way that they cancel each other into perfect equilibrium, an equilibrium so profound and mathematized that no force within that universe possesses the capacity to disturb it. What becomes haunting is how quickly the inhabitants normalize this condition. Children grow up never questioning it. Scientists study it with such rigor and precision that the strangeness dissolves into mere meteorological fact. The sameness becomes comfortable, then invisible, then finally essential, until the very idea of changing seasons feels like the aberration, like something chaotic and dangerous that they are fortunate to have been spared from experiencing. Consider the moment when you wake in the morning and feel the inexplicable certainty that another version of you has continued sleeping, that somewhere in the architecture of your consciousness there exists a parallel thread where you never opened your eyes, where your alarm was never heard, where the decision to rise never crystallized into action. This is not merely the grogginess of transition between states, but rather a peculiar conviction that persists even as you move through your day with full awareness and agency. You might experience this most acutely on mornings when you desperately need more sleep, when your body aches with exhaustion, and in that moment of resistance against waking you feel a strange metaphysical split occurring, as though your consciousness has fractured into the version that obeyed the alarm and the version that sank deeper into the pillow. The mechanism behind this sensation operates through a fundamental property of human consciousness that treats potential outcomes as simultaneously real until they are definitively chosen, a cognitive echo of quantum superposition applied to decision-making rather than particles. Your brain, evolved to consider multiple futures before committing to one, never quite extinguishes the neural pathways of unchosen options, leaving them as ghostly alternatives that feel almost plausible, almost equally valid. This peculiar doubling intensifies because sleep and wakefulness represent the most dramatic boundary in human experience, the daily death and resurrection where vast portions of your mind are temporarily offline, making the fork in reality feel especially significant. What is remarkable is how normalized this sensation has become despite its fundamental illogic, how we speak of our rested selves and tired selves as though they were different entities, how we casually acknowledge that another version persists in sleep without ever questioning whether such persistence is actually possible or merely a trick of introspection. In this parallel universe, you discover that nearly every significant memory you possess has been subtly altered, not by external forces, but by the fundamental nature of how consciousness operates in that reality. You recall your childhood home with perfect clarity, the blue walls, the creaking floorboards, the specific arrangement of furniture, yet when you return to the actual location, nothing matches your recollection. The walls were always yellow, the floorboards were replaced decades ago. The furniture was arranged entirely differently and has been for as long as anyone else can remember. What emerges as you investigate further is that this phenomenon extends beyond simple nostalgia or the well-documented imperfections of human memory. Instead, it represents a systematic divergence between subjective experience and objective reality that has gone unquestioned for so long that entire belief systems have been constructed around it. The psychological mechanism at work involves a subtle disconnect in how sensory information is encoded and retrieved in human consciousness within this universe. Each time you access a memory, your mind doesn't simply recall what happened. Instead, it reconstructs the event based on emotional significance and narrative coherence rather than factual accuracy. Over time, these reconstructions have compounded, layering interpretation upon interpretation until the original experience has become almost entirely obscured by the meaning you've projected onto it. You remember conversations with emotional resonance rather than precise words. You recall motivations that fit the story you've told yourself rather than what people actually expressed. The most unsettling aspect is that everyone exists in this state simultaneously, each person confident in their own false memories while doubting the accounts of others, creating a civilization built on a foundation of collective misremembering where consensus reality becomes merely the agreement between equally mistaken individuals. In a parallel universe, fear does not exist as a biological or psychological response, and the consequences of this absence have reshaped every aspect of human civilization in ways both magnificent and terrifying. People in this world experience no adrenaline spike when facing danger, no instinctive avoidance of threats, no racing heartbeat before public speaking or social rejection. A child can wander into traffic without hesitation, a surgeon can perform delicate procedures without the tremor of anxiety, and a person standing at the edge of a cliff feels only curiosity rather than vertigo. What initially seems like paradise reveals itself to be something far more complex, because fear is not merely an obstacle to overcome, but rather a fundamental mechanism that has guided human survival and shaped civilization itself. The mechanism underlying this reality is biochemical in nature, as if evolution took a different path and eliminated the amygdala's ability to generate fear responses while leaving all other emotional capacities intact. People still feel anger, sadness, joy, and contentment, but the specific neural pathways that produce fear have been completely severed. This absence has forced that civilization to develop entirely different systems of caution and restraint. They rely on pure logic and consequence assessment rather than gut instinct, creating elaborate systems of safeguards, warnings, and protocols where we would simply feel the instinctive terror that makes us recoil from danger. Their buildings are engineered with redundancies that make ours seem fragile. Their vehicles require multiple cognitive approvals before any movement occurs, and their medical procedures involve such exhaustive verification processes that what takes hours in our world takes days in theirs. Yet despite the rational infrastructure they have built to replace fear's protective function, something troubling persists in that world, something they have normalized so completely that it no longer registers as abnormal to them. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that everything around you, every memory you possess, every relationship you cherish, and every object in your environment came into existence exactly 24 hours ago, complete with false memories implanted in your mind and everyone else's mind to suggest a continuous history stretching back decades. You would have no way to verify this reality because there exists no external reference point, no photographic evidence from before yesterday, no independent observer who remembers a time before the universe's creation, and no physical mechanism to distinguish between genuine memories formed over years and artificial memories inserted at the moment of Genesis. This is the philosophical trap known as the problem of induction meeting the demon of skepticism, where the entire framework of causality and temporal continuity becomes suspect the moment you question whether your memories are reliable markers of actual time having passed. The mechanism underlying this dark possibility rests on a fundamental asymmetry in knowledge. The universe, if it began yesterday, would be indistinguishable from a universe that has existed for billions of years because both would produce identical sensory experiences, identical patterns of decay in their evidence, and identical expectations about how things should appear. Your brain, containing all the supposed memories of your childhood and your past relationships, would feel exactly the same whether it formed those neural pathways over 20 years or received them fully formed at the moment of cosmic genesis, because the physical substrate and chemical composition would be identical either way. We persist in believing in continuous history not because we have proved its reality, but because we have collectively decided that the burden of proof falls on those who claim otherwise, establishing a social agreement that requires no verification, no constant re-examination, and no acknowledgement of the fundamental uncertainty underlying our entire temporal framework. Consider the possibility that you are not experiencing reality at all, but rather that you are the dream of another consciousness somewhere else, in another universe, or in another layer of existence entirely, and that your entire world, your memories, your sense of self, and every person you have ever known exists only as a thought within someone else's sleeping mind. This is not a new concept in philosophy, yet it takes on a peculiar weight when you truly sit with it, because it means that everything you perceive as solid and definite is actually just neural activity in someone else's brain, and the moment that consciousness wakes up, you will simply cease to exist, or perhaps you will fade into a kind of liminal non-existence where you are neither alive nor dead, but simply forgotten. The mechanism behind this thought is rooted in the problem of other minds and the fundamental epistemological gap between your subjective experience and objective reality, because there is no way to definitively prove that anyone else experiences consciousness in the way that you do, and therefore there is no way to prove that your world is not merely the dreaming simulation of another being. From a neurological perspective, your brain creates your entire reality through the filtering of sensory data and the construction of meaningful narrative, which means that the universe as you experience it is already a kind of dream, a personalized simulation generated by your own neural processes. And if another consciousness could dream more vividly, more complexly, or more convincingly than your brain does, you would be indistinguishable from that dream. In a universe nearly identical to ours, a woman spent 43 years searching for something she could never quite name, moving through life with the perpetual sense that she had lost something irreplaceable the moment she was born. And when she finally reached the end of her existence, she discovered with absolute certainty that there had never been anything to find, that the absence she felt was not the echo of a missing object, but rather the fundamental structure of consciousness itself. The way awareness naturally generates a hunger for completion that can never be satisfied, because satisfaction would require the thing being sought to exist in the first place. The mechanism behind this phenomenon operates through a peculiar inversion of human perception, wherein the brain's pattern recognition systems evolve to detect threats and opportunities in an environment filled with genuine problems, become so sensitive that they begin manufacturing the sensation of lack in response to the mere fact of being conscious at all, creating an elaborate phantom architecture of longing that feels entirely real because the emotional weight it carries is authentic, even though its object remains forever illusory and undefined. Imagine waking in a world where the sky has simply ceased to exist, not as a physical absence, but as a conceptual one, and in this parallel Earth, humanity never developed the ability to perceive or comprehend anything above the horizon line. The atmosphere remains, clouds still drift, rain still falls, but there exists no unified concept of sky, no word for it in any language, no framework through which inhabitants understand the vast expanse above them. Instead, there are only discrete phenomena. Water falls from somewhere undefined, light comes from an unnamed direction, wind arrives without origin, yet no one experiences these as connected to a single entity called sky. People navigate their entire existence acknowledging each individual weather event while remaining fundamentally blind to the whole, and this blindness is not physical but perceptual, a gap in the architecture of human consciousness itself. The mechanism behind this phenomenon operates through the power of conceptual framework and collective agreement, much like how we on our Earth have normalized countless invisible systems that structure our reality simply because we were taught to see them from birth. Just as we accept that gravity operates without questioning its ultimate nature, these parallel inhabitants accept that phenomena occur without requiring them to originate from anything called sky. The cognitive dissonance never arises because the question is never asked, the category never created, the word never invented, and so there is no awareness of absence. What persists despite having no logical reason is precisely this: the fact that humans can experience the effects of something without ever naming or conceptualizing the cause, and that once a framework of understanding is established in a culture, alternatives become literally unthinkable. In one parallel universe, a pocket of reality exists where temporal progression simply ceased, not catastrophically or violently, but quietly and completely, as if the universe itself decided that forward motion was no longer necessary. On the surface, this pocket appears frozen in every conventional sense. Buildings remain exactly as they were in the moment of cessation, with dust particles suspended in air at precise angles, light rays halted mid-journey through windows, and all matter locked in absolute stillness. Yet within this strange stasis, consciousness persists in a deeply unsettling way, as inhabitants find themselves aware, thinking, remembering, and experiencing sensation, but utterly unable to move or change anything about their circumstances. The psychological mechanism behind this phenomenon emerges from a fundamental misunderstanding of what time actually is within that universe's framework. Rather than time being an external force that propels reality forward, the physicists of that realm discovered too late that time there functioned as a collective agreement, a consensus hallucination that allowed change to occur. When that consensus fractured for reasons no one could determine, the machinery of causality simply stopped accepting inputs. Cause and effect became meaningless concepts because the very substrate that allowed one moment to follow another had evaporated. Most disturbing is how the inhabitants have adapted to this reality, how they have normalized the impossible by developing an entirely new framework for existence within frozen moments. They experience thoughts that seem to progress, conversations that feel like they have temporal flow, yet objectively nothing moves, nothing changes, nothing decays. They have somehow convinced themselves and each other that this is simply another way to exist, another valid state of being, and in doing so, they have trapped themselves in a far more profound prison than mere physical paralysis could ever create. Imagine discovering that you have been living in a universe where a fundamental version of yourself exists elsewhere, and that version is older than you are, despite the fact that you were both born on the same date in your respective realities. In this parallel universe, time moves at a subtly different rate, perhaps imperceptibly slower in your world and imperceptibly faster in theirs, creating a temporal offset that accumulates across the years. You are 35 years old according to your calendar, your body, your memories, but the other you has experienced 42 years of subjective consciousness and cellular aging because their seconds ticked away slightly faster than yours did. There is documentation of this, records you can access, proof that shows their photograph aging differently than yours despite living parallel lives, and yet you cannot feel this difference within yourself. The mechanism behind this phenomenon operates on the principle that time is not universal, but rather locally variable, influenced by gravitational fields, cosmic radiation patterns, or dimensional membrane vibrations that exist just beyond human perception. Your universe experiences a perpetual microsecond delay compared to theirs, like two clocks that are wound with almost identical springs but not quite, and over decades, this barely noticeable discrepancy compounds into years of lost or gained experience. What persists as deeply unsettling about this reality is how we have adapted to it with complete psychological normalization, treating the older versions of ourselves in parallel universes not as anomalies, but as simple facts of existence, the way we accept that gravity works differently on different planets. We do not mourn the time we have not lived, nor do we celebrate the time others have gained, because to acknowledge the existential weight of these temporal variations would require confronting the arbitrary nature of our own aging, our own mortality, our own position in a multiverse where countless versions of us are simultaneously younger and older in ways we can never reconcile or understand. In this parallel universe, you exist in a state of perpetual linguistic absence, where the symbols and sounds that comprise language never formed neural pathways in your developing mind. You move through your day surrounded by other people who speak, who write, who communicate with fluency and ease, yet their words arrive to you as pure noise without meaning, as visual patterns without correspondence to anything in your internal experience. You understand context through gesture and tone, through the emotional weight carried in a voice's inflection, through the spatial relationships between bodies and objects, but the actual building blocks of language, the words themselves, remain foreign territory in your consciousness. The frustration exists not as a sharp pain, but as a chronic background pressure, a constant awareness that others possess a tool you fundamentally lack, and that this absence defines the boundaries of what you can know and express about your own existence. The mechanism behind this reality operates through a simple but total deprivation in early childhood development. Language acquisition requires exposure, repetition, and neural plasticity at precisely the right developmental window, and in this universe, you received none of these conditions. Perhaps you were raised in profound isolation, or perhaps the people around you never spoke to you, never engaged you in the reciprocal dance of communication that builds linguistic competence. By the time you reached an age where language typically crystallizes in the human brain, the window had closed, and your neural architecture settled into patterns that no longer supported the integration of symbolic communication. Now, even when people attempt to teach you, the words slide through your mind without acquiring structure, without becoming real. What persists most unnervingly is how society continues to function around this absence, as though it were merely a personal limitation, rather than a profound fracture in the shared understanding that should unite human beings. Imagine standing at what you believe to be the absolute boundary of existence, only to discover that there is no boundary at all, that the universe continues infinitely in every conceivable direction without cessation or terminus, without the mercy of a final wall or barrier to define where reality ends and the void begins. In this parallel universe, the fundamental architecture of existence operates without edges or borders, meaning that no matter how far any conscious being travels, no matter the velocity or the duration of their journey, they will never encounter the comfort of a definitive ending point, never reach a place where they can understand that they have arrived at the limit of all things. The psychological weight of this infinite topology becomes crushing when examined closely, because human consciousness has evolved to understand the world through boundaries and limits, through the sense that things have beginnings and endings, that spaces are contained and finite. When those boundaries dissolve into pure, unbounded infinity, the mind struggles to construct meaning around such vastness. In this universe, civilizations have developed elaborate philosophical frameworks attempting to comprehend their placelessness within an edgeless cosmos. Yet these frameworks ultimately provide no solace, only temporary intellectual scaffolding that collapses when examined too deeply. What persists despite the horror of such an existence is a strange form of adaptive denial, a collective unconscious agreement among inhabitants to focus obsessively on the local, the immediate, the small sphere of comprehensible space around them, deliberately avoiding contemplation of the infinite directions they could travel but never reach an end. In a parallel universe not unlike our own, there exists a version of you who witnessed something that shattered their understanding of reality, something undeniable and impossible to unsee, yet they made a choice that echoes through their entire existence. They chose to say nothing about it. This version of you saw the inconsistency in a loved one's story, the pattern of small deceptions accumulating like dust, the moment when they realized a fundamental truth about someone they had trusted completely. And instead of speaking, they swallowed the words and let them calcify in their chest. They understood with perfect clarity what would happen if they broke their silence, the arguments that would follow, the relationships that would splinter, the loss of stability and comfort that comes from maintaining the illusion. The psychological mechanism is elegant and devastating in its simplicity. The human mind is capable of remarkable compartmentalization when survival or social cohesion is at stake. By remaining silent, your parallel self preserved the structure around them, kept the family intact or the friendship unbroken, maintained their position within the ecosystem of relationships that define their identity. But silence is not neutral. It is an active choice with infinite consequences. Without speaking, they became complicit in whatever continued unchecked. They became a witness who refused to witness, a consciousness split between what they knew and what they performed. The weight of this unchosen truth pressed upon them daily. They became someone who flinched at certain moments, who understood the weight of words they never said, who lived in a carefully constructed world where they were simultaneously both insider and exile. What is perhaps most haunting about this parallel existence is how normal it became. After months and years of silence, your other self stopped noticing the cost. The deception became the baseline. They learned to live in the cognitive dissonance, to function while fractured, because this is what countless people do in countless universes every single day. Imagine walking through a parallel universe where the color red, the one you have known your entire life as a symbol of danger, passion, and warning, instead triggers feelings of calm, safety, and maternal comfort, while the color blue, traditionally associated with serenity and trust in your world, fills inhabitants with inexplicable dread and anxiety that borders on panic. In this reality, traffic lights operate on completely inverted principles, with blue lights commanding vehicles to stop and red lights signaling permission to proceed, and this has shaped the entire cultural and psychological landscape of that world for millennia. Children are taught from birth that seeing blue in certain contexts means they should prepare for threat, while red wrapping paper on a gift box indicates something dangerous is inside, not something precious. The phenomenon extends beyond simple association into something far more profound and unsettling. The actual neurological and emotional response to these colors has become hardwired differently at a fundamental level, suggesting that color meaning is not some universal constant written into the fabric of human perception, but rather a deeply malleable cultural construct that can be completely reoriented through generations of reinforcement and collective agreement. This reveals something deeply disquieting about our own world, which is that we treat our color associations as though they are objective truths handed down from nature itself, when in reality they are merely the accumulated weight of arbitrary decisions made by societies that could have chosen differently at any point in history. We have normalized the idea that red means stop and green means go, that black represents mourning and white represents purity, that purple conveys royalty and yellow conveys cowardice, all without questioning whether these associations hold any actual power beyond what we have collectively decided to grant them. Consider the moment when you first accepted that time moves forward and never backward, that the present moment is always slipping away from you into an irretrievable past, and that you have no choice but to move with it or be left behind. You were likely very young when you absorbed this concept into your understanding of reality, so young that you cannot actually remember the moment of acceptance, and this is precisely the mechanism that allows it to persist without scrutiny. We inherit temporal frameworks from our culture and language the same way we inherit the shape of our sentences, so completely integrated into the architecture of thought that questioning their validity feels almost impossible, like trying to see the color of the air around you. In a parallel universe nearby, time may move in multiple directions simultaneously, or perhaps it does not move at all and instead expands outward in all directions like the petals of an infinite flower. Yet the inhabitants of that world are no more aware of their temporal strangeness than you are aware of yours. The psychological mechanism here is one of normalization through exposure and early adoption, the same force that makes any inherited system of thought feel like bedrock truth rather than an arbitrary human construction. We do not question our calendar, our clocks, our division of days into hours and hours into minutes, because we have been steeped in these divisions since before we could form coherent memories, since before we could even recognize that alternatives might exist. The very language we use to describe time reinforces the framework itself, creating a self-sealing logical loop in which questioning the system requires tools built from that same system. What you never questioned became invisible not through deception, but through the simple and terrible process of becoming so familiar that familiarity itself became proof of truth. Imagine stepping into a universe where the sun exists, where light sources shine brilliantly across landscapes and through buildings, yet nothing casts a shadow. Objects remain fully illuminated on all sides as though light passes through them without obstruction, or as though the very concept of obstruction has been removed from the physics of that reality. Trees stand in fields with no dark pools beneath their canopies. People walk through streets, and their bodies do not interrupt the light around them. Buildings rise without casting darkness on the ground or on neighboring structures. The phenomenon is complete and consistent throughout this world, affecting every object, every creature, every surface that should theoretically block light and create shadow. What makes this particular reality so profoundly unsettling is that nobody in that world notices anything wrong. They navigate their environment exactly as we do, developing architectural styles, artistic movements, and daily routines as though shadows had always been absent, as though the visual world they experience is entirely normal and requires no explanation or adjustment. The mechanism behind this strange adaptation lies in how consciousness observes and normalizes its surroundings. The human brain does not question the fundamental parameters of existence if those parameters remain consistent within a person's lived experience. If shadows have never existed in a person's world, the neurological systems responsible for visual interpretation simply integrate shadowlessness into the basic architecture of how that consciousness perceives depth, dimension, and spatial relationships. They perceive dimension through other cues, subtle shifts in color gradation, atmospheric perspective, the relative positions of objects, and the way light interacts with texture. What is truly disturbing is recognizing that this world persists with perfect functionality despite the absence of something we consider so essential to visual perception and psychological comfort. Imagine discovering through some inexplicable means that another version of you exists in a parallel universe, living an almost identical life with the same memories, the same choices, the same crucial moments, yet that version is somehow younger than you are, their body having aged differently despite sharing the same temporal starting point, their face carrying fewer lines, their hair retaining more of its original color, their movements still possessing a suppleness that yours no longer quite manages. And the logical impossibility of this situation creates a profound disorientation, because you cannot reconcile how two consciousnesses that branched from the same point could have experienced time at fundamentally different rates. The mechanism behind this dark reality operates on the principle that parallel universes need not follow identical physical laws, that the rate at which time passes or bodies deteriorate might vary subtly between dimensions, that aging itself could be governed by different constants or biological processes that appear nearly identical from the outside, but function at dramatically different speeds at the molecular level. Creating a scenario where your other self has simply experienced less cellular degradation, less accumulated wear, less of the inevitable march toward entropy that you have endured. Imagine standing in a vast, infinite expanse where there exists no privileged point of origin, no sacred location from which all things radiate outward, no cosmic heart from which existence pulses with meaning and direction. In this parallel universe, the very concept of centrality has been fundamentally dissolved, and what we might call spatial geometry operates under principles that render the notion of a center not merely distant or hidden, but genuinely and mathematically non-existent. Every observer, regardless of their position in this universe, would measure themselves as equidistant from the edges of creation, yet those edges would never arrive, never become manifest, never solidify into observable boundaries. The universe expands uniformly in all directions simultaneously from the perspective of every single point, making each location simultaneously central and peripheral, both the beginning and nowhere at all. This is not a poetic abstraction, but rather the actual cosmological description that our own physicists have arrived at, yet we continue to operate as though some center still exists, some axis around which meaning continues to turn. The psychological mechanism that sustains this disconnect stems from our evolutionary inheritance as creatures who evolved to navigate limited three-dimensional space with clear horizons, distinct boundaries, and identifiable reference points. Our consciousness developed in environments where centers mattered tremendously: the center of the tribe, the center of our territory, the center of our bodies, and this experiential architecture remains embedded so deeply within our thinking that we cannot easily shake it, even when confronted with mathematical truth. We have normalized this contradiction by developing elaborate mental compartments where everyday intuition operates separately from cosmological fact, allowing us to believe in centerless expansion while still unconsciously orienting ourselves toward invisible centers in countless decisions, rituals, and beliefs, never fully reconciling the gulf between what we know and what we feel to be true. Imagine a universe where the fundamental discovery that atoms are mostly empty space is taken not as a curiosity of quantum mechanics, but as a literal architectural flaw in reality itself. In this parallel world, physicists made the same observations we did about electron clouds and nuclear density, but rather than accepting this as the nature of matter, they interpreted it as evidence that atoms in their universe are genuinely hollow, like microscopic shells of substance surrounding vast voids. This interpretation cascaded through their entire understanding of physics and material reality, becoming the foundational assumption upon which their technology and worldview rest. They built their civilizations on the uncomfortable knowledge that everything around them, every wall, every body, every planet, is essentially nothing held together by invisible forces and probability clouds, with emptiness making up more than 99% of apparent matter. The psychological mechanism behind this persistent belief stems from how they process quantum uncertainty differently than we do. Where we develop mathematics and philosophical frameworks to comfort ourselves with the idea that emptiness is somehow still real through field interactions and force carriers, their civilization made no such peace. They confronted the hollow nature of existence directly, allowing this knowledge to penetrate deeply into their cultural consciousness and artistic expression. They developed entire philosophical movements around the concept of essential emptiness, and their architecture reflects a kind of defensive acceptance, creating structures that acknowledge their own illusory solidity through design choices that seem almost transparent or deliberately fragile to human eyes. What persists most disturbingly about this normalized horror is that they continue building and living as though their atoms remain reliably dense, despite knowing with certainty that they do not. There exists a peculiar category of things that we encounter throughout our entire lives, things so mundane and ubiquitous that they become invisible to us, and yet when we finally pause to consider them, we realize we have never once genuinely questioned why they exist in the first place. And this absence of curiosity itself becomes a dark reality, because it reveals how thoroughly we have accepted the arbitrary frameworks of our reality without ever demanding justification or explanation for them. Consider the simple fact that you have spent decades walking past certain buildings, eating certain foods, following certain social rituals, and observing certain rules without ever wondering about their origins or purposes. And you will notice that this gap in your curiosity was not accidental, but rather systematically cultivated through exposure so gradual and comprehensive that questioning never became a natural impulse. The psychological mechanism behind this phenomenon is rooted in what researchers call normalization through repetition, wherein our brains develop what amounts to perceptual blindness towards stimuli that remain constant and unchanging, prioritizing instead the novel and the threatening, which means that anything established before our conscious memory formed, or anything that has remained consistent throughout our lives, never triggers the neural patterns associated with curiosity or investigation. We are born into a world already constructed by previous generations, and we inherit not just their physical infrastructure but also their unexamined assumptions, their unchallenged traditions, and their accepted limitations. And because we arrive as learners rather than architects, we simply absorb these things as facts rather than interpretations, as constants rather than choices. Imagine waking in a version of Earth where the invisible lines drawn on maps simply do not exist, where no nation-states have ever formed, and where the entire human civilization has organized itself through completely different spatial and political structures. In this parallel universe, there are no countries, no flags, no passports, no citizenship documents, and no national anthems. People move freely across what we would recognize as continental boundaries, yet the world maintains perfect order through an entirely decentralized system of autonomous regions organized by bioregion, watershed, and cultural affinity, rather than arbitrary geographic divisions established through centuries of war and treaty. The concept of your country, or my country, never emerged in their historical development because the fundamental understanding of how human societies should organize themselves took a radically different path. Instead of the nation-state model spreading globally through colonization and geopolitics, their ancestors developed cooperative federations based on ecological zones and shared resources, where governance flows naturally from the land itself rather than being imposed upon it through force. The psychological mechanism underlying this alternative reality is rooted in how early civilizations in that world prioritized interconnection over separation, understanding intuitively that arbitrary borders create conflict and suffering. Their philosophers and leaders recognized that drawing lines through inhabited territories inevitably produces injustice, war, and the perpetual need for military enforcement. Yet what makes this parallel universe deeply unsettling to contemplate is that in our world, we have somehow normalized and accepted this brutal system entirely. We are born into nation-states and taught that borders are natural, necessary, inevitable features of human geography, when in fact they are purely constructed abstractions that cause immense suffering. In parallel universe theory, there exists a particularly unsettling concept that merges quantum mechanics with existential dread, and it suggests that for every choice you do not make, there is a version of you who did make it, existing in a branching timeline that is simultaneously real and forever inaccessible to your consciousness. When you decline a job offer, refuse a relationship, choose not to board a plane, or decide against speaking up in a crucial moment, the mathematics of infinite probability suggests that somewhere in the sprawling multiverse, another version of you accepted that opportunity, pursued that connection, took that flight, or voiced those words with complete conviction. What makes this concept particularly dark is not merely the existence of these alternate paths, but the troubling implication that somewhere in the fabric of reality, another you is living out all the consequences of those choices you deliberately avoided, experiencing the outcomes both triumphant and devastating that your actual self will never know. This version is waiting, existing in their own subjective present moment, potentially wondering about the versions of themselves who chose differently, creating an infinite regress of parallel selves eternally separated by choices both monumental and infinitesimal. The psychological weight of this realization manifests in the human mind as a constant, quiet anguish, a nagging awareness that for every path you walk, there are infinite paths you have abandoned, each one leading to a version of your consciousness that experiences joy or suffering you can never access or verify. We have normalized this existential framework by absorbing it into our vocabulary through phrases like another life and the road not taken, transforming what should be an overwhelming cosmic horror into poetic metaphor, thereby dulling its sharp edges and making it safe for casual contemplation. In one particular parallel universe, the concept of spatial distance operates as a purely psychological construct rather than a measurable physical property. And inhabitants of this realm have begun to realize that their understanding of how far things truly are from one another has never been anchored to any objective reality whatsoever. A person might walk for what feels like hours through a city street, experiencing fatigue and the passage of time, only to discover that they have somehow arrived at their destination instantaneously, while another journey of identical perceived effort might stretch across what seems like infinite kilometers that their body insists they have traveled despite the landscape never actually changing. The human experience of distance in this world depends entirely on expectation, emotional state, and cultural memory rather than on any measurable unit of space, which means that the distance between two lovers separated by a single room can feel impossibly vast and unbridgeable, while the distance between continents can collapse into nothing the moment genuine connection is established between two minds. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon operates through the observation that distance itself was always a human invention, a way of categorizing space through instruments and numbers that our ancestors created to impose order on an incomprehensible vastness. And in this universe, that invention has simply failed to take hold in the way it did in our own reality, leaving inhabitants to navigate existence through pure perception rather than through the mediation of measurement. What makes this reality so deeply unsettling is not the mechanism itself, but rather the way inhabitants continue to insist that distance must be real, that their maps and instruments and calculations must mean something, even as their lived experience constantly contradicts every rational framework they construct to understand it, creating a society simultaneously obsessed with precision while being utterly unable to define what is actually being measured. Imagine stepping into a parallel universe where the fundamental nature of reality has shifted in one crucial way. There is no sound, not silence in the way we understand it, where sound exists but is merely absent, but a complete absence of the physical phenomenon itself. In this universe, vibrations still occur, molecules still collide and move through air and water and solid matter, but they produce nothing that could be perceived as audio. The vocal cords of creatures still move, the wings of insects still beat, the wind still rushes through trees and canyons, yet none of it generates the waves of pressure that we recognize as sound. What makes this reality so deeply unsettling is how the inhabitants of this world have built their entire civilization around this constraint without ever questioning it, creating elaborate systems of communication and warning mechanisms based entirely on visual and tactile information. They have developed language through rapid hand gestures and color-changing skin patterns. They navigate their environments through vibrations felt through the ground and through the air itself, and they have constructed early warning systems for danger using cascades of light rather than sirens or calls. The psychological mechanism at work here is one of complete adaptation and normalization. These beings have never known sound, so they cannot conceptualize its absence as a loss. To them, this is simply how reality functions. They look at historical records and find no mention of audio. They study physics and find that the mathematics describing their world simply does not include acoustic waves, and they accept this as fundamental truth. Yet what persists beneath this acceptance is something more unsettling, a kind of existential echo, a phantom sensation in their consciousness that something is missing from their experience of existence, something they cannot name because they lack the framework to describe it. They sometimes sit in groups and attempt to vocalize, producing movements of air that generate no sensation, and they feel a profound emptiness in the attempt itself. In a parallel universe adjacent to your own, there exists a version of you who made a single different choice decades ago, and in that timeline, they discovered something that your iteration never quite managed to locate: a genuine, sustainable sense of comfort that did not require constant vigilance or self-doubt. This version of you chose differently at a crucial junction, perhaps selecting a partner who provided stability rather than excitement, or pursuing a career that offered predictability instead of prestige, or remaining in a place that felt safe rather than chasing the promise of transformation elsewhere. The peculiar darkness of this reality is that this alternate version does not know they are comforted, because comfort, when it is truly present and uninterrupted, becomes invisible to the person experiencing it. They wake without the gnawing sensation of incompleteness. They make decisions without the paralyzing weight of alternative possibilities. They exist in relationships where there is no constant audit of whether they chose correctly. The mechanism underlying this psychological phenomenon is that humans measure contentment primarily through comparison and contrast. And when nothing in your life violates your expectations, your nervous system simply stops generating the alert signals that would make you consciously aware of well-being. You begin to assume that your calm is normal, baseline, unremarkable, and therefore you never develop the acute gratitude that might cement it in your memory as something precious. In your timeline, you may spend decades pursuing the exact conditions that your parallel self possesses unconsciously, never quite achieving it because you are always watching yourself achieve it, always measuring the distance between the theoretical comfort and the actual experience. That other version, meanwhile, simply lives inside their contentment the way you live inside the air, never questioning whether the oxygen is sufficient, never doubting whether they should have chosen different molecules to breathe. Imagine waking in this parallel world to discover that the planet no longer tilts on its axis, and what you've always known as the cycle of seasons has simply ceased to exist. The Earth in this reality maintains a perfectly perpendicular rotation relative to its orbital path around the Sun, meaning every location on the planet receives nearly identical amounts of sunlight throughout the entire year. Spring does not come, summer does not arrive with its promise of warmth, autumn never paints the leaves in gold and crimson, and winter's crystalline silence never settles across the hemispheres. Instead, there exists only an eternal present, a perpetual equilibrium where the climate in any given location remains essentially unchanged from one month to the next, year after year, extending backward through countless generations. The psychological impact of this absence is profound and destabilizing in ways that are difficult to articulate, for humans evolved across millions of years with the seasons as an inescapable rhythm underlying all existence, a fundamental organizing principle that shaped our biology, our agriculture, our religions, our very conception of time itself. Without seasons, there is no natural cycle of renewal and decay, no springtime rebirth to inspire hope, no winter dormancy to encourage reflection, no autumn harvest to mark accomplishment, and no summer abundance to sustain us. The world becomes static, unchanging, an eternal middle ground where variation exists only in the random fluctuations of weather rather than in any predictable pattern. Yet despite the obvious catastrophic consequences for agriculture, for migratory species, for the entire delicate balance of ecosystems that depend upon seasonal triggers, civilization in this world persists, and people have built their societies around this unchanging reality as though it were perfectly natural. In a universe almost identical to your own, there exists a version of you who made different choices at every critical juncture, who chose the safer path when you took the risk, who stayed when you left, who spoke when you remained silent, and who somehow arrived at a place of genuine contentment that eludes you entirely. This parallel self experiences no regret because they never encountered the consequences of the roads not taken, never wondering what might have been, never tormented by the ghost of alternate possibilities that haunt your waking hours. They go to sleep without the weight of decisions pressing against their chest, without replaying conversations in the darkness, without constructing elaborate narratives of how things could have been different if only they had possessed more courage or more caution. The mechanism that allows this peace to exist is fundamentally rooted in the human condition's relationship with knowledge and uncertainty. Your suffering derives not from your actual circumstances alone, but from the perpetual awareness that you exist within a single timeline where your choices matter irrevocably, where you carry full responsibility for the paths you eliminated, where the unopened doors represent infinite loss. That version of you, however, experiences peace precisely because they exist in isolation from your consciousness, separated by the barrier between universes, never able to contemplate the life you are living, never haunted by roads they did not take. They do not know that their sacrifice was your gain, that their safety was your freedom, that their contentment came at the price of their potential. What makes this reality particularly unsettling is how completely we have normalized this fragmentation of self, how we accept that we cannot simultaneously live all possible lives, how we have learned to make peace with the necessity of choosing one timeline at the expense of infinite others.